My son-in-law Wyatt thought I was just a harmless, weak old man with a bad limp and a meager pension. He thought my daughter was completely isolated. That was until she sent me her emergency code at 2 in the morning. 5 minutes later, he was on his knees begging. My name is Dominic Rollins. I am 69 years old, and the limp I walk with is a carefully crafted lie. Before I tell you how I dismantled this arrogant hedge fund manager piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that true power never needs to shout. It was exactly 2 in the morning when my phone screen illuminated the dark bedroom. A single text message glowed against the black background. Yellow bird. It was from Camille, my 32-year-old daughter. Those 2 words were a protocol I had drilled into her head since she was 10 years old, to be used only if her life was in imminent danger. The moment I saw that phrase, the hunched posture I maintained for the last 4 years vanished. I did not reach for my fake walking cane. I stood up with a perfectly straight spine, my heart rate lowering into a cold, calculated rhythm. Wyatt had always looked at me across the table with thinly veiled disgust, a wealthy executive looking down on a retired black postal worker who drove a beat-up 2005 Honda Accord. He thought his emotional abuse of my daughter went unnoticed. He was severely mistaken. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door, ready to show him the real Dominic Rollins tonight, without any trace of mercy or hesitation at all. I went straight to the false floorboard in my closet and pulled out a shock-proof matte black case. Inside was a military-grade encrypted laptop that had not seen the light of day since my supposed retirement. I tossed it onto the passenger seat of my Honda and started the engine. As I sped through the empty city streets, I connected the laptop to the cellular network and began typing with practiced, rapid precision. Wyatt Kensington thought I spent my days sorting mail and cashing government checks. He had absolutely no idea that for 3 decades I was a senior forensic accountant for the federal government. I did not carry a badge or a gun. I carried algorithms. My entire career was spent hunting down the hidden money of cartels, corrupt politicians, and untouchable billionaires. I dismantled empires by following the blood money they thought they had scrubbed clean. The limp I presented to the world was actually a parting gift from a Chicago money laundering syndicate 20 years ago, but it was also the perfect disguise. People do not fear a crippled old man, they pity him, and pity makes them incredibly careless. While my left hand steered the wheel, my right hand danced across the keyboard, executing scripts I had written years ago. I had been quietly monitoring Wyatt since the day Camille married him. I knew every account number, every offshore trust, and every shell company he used to hide his assets. He was a sloppy, arrogant man who left digital footprints everywhere. Within 3 minutes of the drive, I bypassed the biometric security of his primary banking portal. I did not just look at his balances, I locked them down. I routed an emergency federal fraud alert through a proxy server directly to his wealth management firm. One by one, his elite credit cards, his investment portfolios, and his untouchable trust funds were flagged and frozen. The system classified him as a severe flight risk under federal investigation. I pulled up to his massive $2 million suburban mansion. The house was entirely dark, except for the lights blazing in the living room window. I could see their shadows moving aggressively against the curtains. My daughter was in danger. I slammed the laptop shut, grabbed a heavy steel tire iron from my trunk, and walked up the pristine driveway. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I was no longer playing the polite father-in-law. I was the ghost from the Treasury Department, and I was bringing absolute hell to his front doorstep. I gripped the cold metal tightly, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline. The time for hiding was officially over for good now. I swung the heavy tire iron back and smashed it into the glass pane of the front door. The shattering sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet neighborhood. I reached through the broken glass, unlocked the deadbolt, and kicked the heavy wooden door open, sending it slamming against the interior wall. I stepped into the foyer, dropping the tire iron onto the pristine hardwood floor with a loud metallic clatter. Wyatt was standing in the center of the living room. His face was flushed red with anger, and his hand was twisted tightly in the hair of Camille. My daughter was on her knees, weeping silently. Wyatt turned his head to look at me, his expression shifting from shock to a twisted, condescending smirk. "You have got to be kidding me," he sneered, letting go of Camille. She immediately scrambled into the corner, shaking. He took a step toward me, adjusting the cuffs of his designer shirt. "You broke into my house, you crippled old black man. Are you out of your mind? I will have you locked away in a cell for the rest of your miserable life." I did not yell. I did not throw a punch. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket and looked him dead in the eyes. "Your life as you know it ended exactly 2 minutes ago, Wyatt." I pressed the execution button on my screen. His smartphone resting on the marble coffee table immediately began to vibrate wildly. Ping after ping after ping, notification alarms filled the room. Wyatt frowned, stepping back to pick up his device. He glanced at the screen and his arrogant smirk melted into a mask of pure terror. "What is this?" he whispered. "American Express black card suspended. Investment portfolio frozen by federal mandate. Offshore trust funds locked under suspicion of wire fraud." He frantically tapped his screen, trying to open his banking applications, but every single one returned the same red error message stating his assets had been seized. "This is a mistake," he stammered, looking up at me wildly. "What did you do?" I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my posture towering over him. "I did not do anything, Wyatt. I just turned on the lights so the federal government could see exactly what kind of thief you are." He dropped his phone and sank to his knees on the rug, begging. Before I could savor the moment of his absolute defeat, the piercing wail of police sirens tore through the quiet suburban air. Red and blue lights began flashing through the front windows, casting erratic, long shadows across the living room walls. The heavy thud of multiple car doors slamming shut echoed from the driveway outside. Wyatt stopped begging. He slowly raised his head, and the sheer terror that had gripped his face just seconds ago vanished completely. In its place, a cold, calculated smirk slowly stretched across his mouth. He wiped a hand across his nose, smearing a terrifyingly realistic-looking stream of theatrical fake blood down his cheek and onto the collar of his expensive white shirt. "I called the cops 10 minutes ago when I saw you pull up," he whispered, his voice dripping with venomous triumph. "They are not here for me, Dominic. They are here for the crazy old man who just committed an armed home invasion. You are going to rot in a federal prison for the rest of your pathetic, miserable life, old man, right here today." The front door flew completely off its hinges as 3 uniformed police officers stormed into the living room with their service weapons drawn and tactical flashlights blinding my vision. "Drop the weapon and get on the ground right now!" the lead officer screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I did not hesitate or make any sudden defensive movements. I slowly raised my empty hands and lowered myself onto the cold, hardwood floor. Wyatt instantly transformed into the perfect victim. He cowered behind his expensive leather sofa, clutching his face where the fake blood continued to smear across his cheek. "Officer, thank God you are here," he cried out, his voice trembling with manufactured terror. "My father-in-law just lost his mind. He smashed through the glass with a tire iron and attacked me without warning. He is completely unstable and violent. Please keep him away from my wife before he kills us both." Camille remained huddled in the corner of the room. Her eyes were wide with shock, and she was trembling so violently she could not form a single coherent word to defend me. The officers did not pause to ask questions or assess the actual situation. They saw a young, wealthy white executive supposedly bleeding in his luxury suburban home and an old black man lying next to a heavy steel tire iron. The implicit bias of the situation worked exactly as Wyatt had calculated. 2 officers rushed forward and drove their knees sharply into my back, pressing my face hard against the floorboards. They wrenched my arms behind my back, and the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped tightly around my wrists, biting into my skin. Wyatt stood up slowly, letting out a highly theatrical sigh of relief. He looked down at me with a sickening sneer of absolute triumph, clearly believing he had just won the ultimate victory. He thought he had successfully neutralized the only threat to his perfect facade and secured my permanent removal from his life. The rough physical treatment sent a sharp, familiar spike of agony shooting down my left leg. I gritted my teeth against the sudden pain, but remained chillingly calm. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on regulating my breathing, ensuring my heart rate remained steady. Wyatt and everyone else in my life always assumed my severe limp was the pathetic result of old age and deteriorating joints. They were entirely wrong. That limp was a permanent physical souvenir from a .45 caliber bullet I took straight to the thigh exactly 10 years ago inside a freezing Chicago warehouse. I was conducting an undercover audit on a massive cartel money laundering front when a sudden gunfight broke out between the syndicate and local law enforcement. I took that bullet shielding a young, terrified rookie detective who had accidentally stumbled directly into the line of fire. I saved his life that night, and he never forgot the immense debt he owed the ghost auditor who pulled him out of the deadly crossfire. That rookie detective is now the current chief of police of this exact city. I know exactly how the justice system operates from the inside out, and I know precisely how to bypass these street-level theatrics. The aggressive lead officer yanked me up to my feet by the collar of my jacket, shoving me roughly against the wall. "You have the right to remain silent, old man," he growled, leaning in close so I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. I looked him dead in the eye, completely unfazed by his physical intimidation. "I am waiving that right, officer," I said, my voice steady and commanding, holding a tone of absolute authority. Reach into the left inner pocket of my coat, take out my wallet, pull out my state identification card, and scan the digital square printed on the bottom right corner of the back. The officer let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, tightening his grip on my shoulder to exert dominance. "You do not give the orders here," he snapped aggressively. "You are going to jail for a very long time for armed home invasion." I did not blink or look away. I lowered my voice to a sharp, authoritative register and stated a highly classified alphanumeric federal override code. "Check the back of the card right now, or you will be standing in an office explaining to Chief Miller tomorrow morning why you deliberately ignored a Priority 1 federal directive in his jurisdiction." The mention of the chief of police by name and the absolute unwavering certainty in my tone made the officer freeze instantly. His aggressive demeanor faltered as doubt crept into his mind. He exchanged an uncertain look with his partner before cautiously reaching into my coat pocket and retrieving my wallet. He pulled out the ID card, flipped it over, and illuminated the small, encrypted square with his tactical flashlight. He pulled out his department-issued secure mobile terminal and scanned the code. The secure mobile terminal processed the encrypted data for exactly 3 seconds before emitting a sharp, high-pitched confirmation chime that cut through the tension in the room. The screen illuminated with a solid bright red banner displaying a Level 1 federal security clearance and a direct contact mandate for the chief of police. The lead officer stared at the glowing screen as the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him deathly pale. His arrogant expression dissolved into pure, unfiltered panic. He looked from the digital terminal up to my face, realizing the catastrophic professional mistake he had just made. He was physically holding a man who had more operational authority in this city than his own precinct commander. "Unlock these cuffs," I stated quietly but firmly. The officer did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. His hands were physically shaking as he fumbled for his key ring. He quickly unlocked the heavy steel cuffs and took a large, respectful step backward, creating space between us. "I am incredibly sorry, sir," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We did not know the protocol or who you were." I rubbed my bruised wrists, slowly adjusting the sleeves of my jacket to restore my flawless posture. "Do your job properly, officer," I replied, keeping my gaze fixed forward. Wyatt watched this sudden, inexplicable reversal of power with complete bewilderment. His manufactured victim act fractured as he stepped out from behind the safety of the sofa. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at the police officers. "Arrest him right now. He broke into my home and assaulted me. Put those handcuffs back on him immediately." The lead officer turned toward Wyatt, and the apologetic, subservient demeanor he had just shown me was instantly replaced by a harsh, furious glare. "Step back and lower your voice right now," the officer commanded, placing his hand firmly on his utility belt, ready to draw his weapon if necessary. Wyatt stopped dead in his tracks, utterly confused by the sudden intense hostility from the men he thought he had successfully manipulated to do his bidding. The dynamic in the living room had shifted violently and irrevocably. Wyatt was no longer the protected, wealthy homeowner directing the local police force to remove a nuisance. He was suddenly a prime suspect standing in the crosshairs of federal authority. "You do not understand," he yelled, frantically wiping the remaining fake blood from his cheek in his agitation. "This is my property and I am the victim here." Wyatt completely lost whatever remained of his composed executive facade. He threw his arms up in a desperate, furious tantrum, his face twisting with rage and blinding entitlement. "I demand you remove this absolute maniac from my property immediately," he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "I pay the massive property taxes in this city. This is my $2 million house, and I want him arrested for trespassing and aggravated assault right this second. If you do not drag him out of here in chains, I will personally ensure I have all of your badges by tomorrow morning." I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us with slow, measured steps. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and slowly pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of legal paper. The police officers watched in complete tense silence as I unfolded the official document and held it out in the space between us. I looked directly into the panicked, frantic eyes of my son-in-law and delivered the brutal reality check he never saw coming. "You do not own this house, Wyatt." Wyatt stared at the single sheet of legal paper in my hand for a fraction of a second before a loud, abrasive laugh erupted from his throat. The sheer audacity of my statement seemed to temporarily override his panic. He shook his head, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, acting as though he was dealing with a delusional patient rather than a federal auditor. "You have completely lost your mind, Dominic," he mocked, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "I hold the deed to this property. This is a $2 million estate sitting in the most exclusive zip code in the state. My name is on the county registry. My name is on the massive property tax bills I pay every single year. You cannot just walk in here with a random printed document and pretend you own a luxury mansion." The lead police officer shifted uncomfortably, keeping a respectful distance from me, but watching Wyatt closely. Wyatt pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers tapping aggressively against the glass screen. "I am ending this ridiculous charade right now," he declared, holding the phone up for everyone in the room to see. "I am calling my personal attorney, Bradley Cole. He is a senior partner at the most ruthless real estate law firm in this city. He handles all my properties and trusts. I am putting him on speakerphone right now so these officers can hear a certified legal expert confirm that I am the sole owner of this estate. Then I want you dragged out of here in chains for criminal trespassing." The phone began to ring loudly through the silent living room, echoing off the high ceilings as Wyatt held it out like a weapon of ultimate destruction. I stepped forward and calmly placed the contract face down on the glass coffee table right next to where his phone continued to ring. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy precision of a man who dealt exclusively in undeniable facts. "You are a man who loves the appearance of wealth, Wyatt," I said smoothly. "But you despise the actual mechanics of money. 4 years ago, you were secretly drowning in a massive ocean of toxic debt. You leveraged your initial investments on terrible margin calls, and you lost spectacularly. You were entirely underwater on this mortgage facing imminent foreclosure and complete social humiliation. You desperately needed a bailout, but you were too arrogant to ask your wealthy white family for help. So you searched for a private equity firm willing to offer high-risk refinancing. That is when you found Apex Holdings." The ringing on his phone suddenly stopped, replaced by the sharp click of an answered call, but Wyatt was frozen, staring at me. "You thought Apex Holdings was just a generic, faceless corporate entity, willing to throw cash at a struggling executive," I continued, my tone dropping into a deadly whisper. "You signed 50 pages of dense legal paperwork without reading the fine print because you were suffocating and Apex was your only oxygen tank. You were so desperate to maintain your country club lifestyle that you blindly transferred the primary deed of this property to the holding company in exchange for the capital to cover your margin calls. You thought you were signing a refinancing agreement. You were actually signing a total asset surrender." I took a deliberate step closer, watching his throat swallow hard. "You never bothered to look into who owned the shell company that bailed you out. I did not just audit money launderers during my career, Wyatt. I learned exactly how they hide capital in plain sight. I created Apex Holdings specifically to monitor your financial failures. I personally reviewed and approved that desperation loan. You have not been a homeowner for 4 years. You have been paying exorbitant monthly rent to a corporate landlord, and that landlord is standing right in front of you." Bradley Cole answered the phone, his groggy voice breaking the tension in the room. "Wyatt, what is going on? It is 2 a.m. Wyatt blinked rapidly, trying to process the catastrophic revelation I had just dropped on him. The color completely drained from his face as his eyes darted from the legal document on the table back to my steady, unyielding gaze. He desperately gripped the phone. "Bradley, listen to me carefully," Wyatt yelled into the speakerphone, his voice cracking with a sudden, violent wave of terror. "My crazy father-in-law is standing in my living room claiming that a company called Apex Holdings owns my house. He says I signed the deed over 4 years ago. Tell these police officers right now that he is lying. Tell them I own this property." A long, agonizing silence stretched across the speakerphone. The only sound in the room was Camille softly crying in the corner and the heavy breathing of the police officers. Bradley Wyatt screamed, "Tell them!" Wyatt the lawyer finally spoke, his voice heavy with sudden dread. I told you 4 years ago to let me review the Apex contract before you signed it. You refused because you needed the wire transfer within 24 hours to stop the margin call. You signed a quitclaim deed. Apex Holdings is the sole legal owner of the property. You are classified as a month-to-month tenant. I am sorry, Wyatt, but technically you do not own the house. Wyatt dropped the phone. It shattered against the hardwood floor. He fell back against the wall, gasping for air as the reality of his complete dispossession crushed him. I turned to the lead police officer and handed him the document. This is a court-approved eviction notice effective immediately due to a violation of the morality and criminal activity clauses in his lease, I stated coldly. Remove this tenant from my property. The officer did not hesitate. The absolute authority of my federal clearance combined with the undeniable legal proof gave him all the jurisdiction he needed. 2 officers stepped forward and grabbed Wyatt by the arms. He began to thrash and kick, screaming incoherently as they dragged him across his own living room. He was wearing nothing but a pair of silk pajamas and expensive slippers. They hauled him through the shattered front door, pulling him violently down the freezing concrete driveway. The winter air was biting and harsh, a brutal shock to a man who had lived his entire life wrapped in unearned luxury. I stood in the doorway watching the officers force him toward the flashing lights of the police cruiser. He fought against their grip, his bare feet scraping against the icy pavement as his prestigious executive identity was violently stripped away in front of his wealthy neighbors. The freezing wind whipped across the front lawn, biting into Wyatt as he stood shivering violently beside the police cruiser. The red and blue emergency lights washed over his pale, desperate face, illuminating the sheer hatred burning in his eyes. He shoved his shoulder against the officer, trying to break free just enough to face me. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as the icy air hit his lungs. He realized his physical intimidation and his property were entirely gone, but the malice in his mind was still actively working. "You think you won tonight, Dominic," he sneered, his voice echoing across the silent suburban street. "You think taking this house changes anything. You are forgetting the master plan, old man. Camille signed the ironclad prenup before we got married. I made sure of it. You might kick me out into the cold tonight, but I am taking 80% of your daughter's veterinary clinic tomorrow morning. I am going to destroy her life's work." The officers shoved him into the back of the cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut. The morning sun broke through the shattered front door, casting harsh geometric shadows across the living room floor. Camille sat at the kitchen island staring blankly at a thick stack of legal documents delivered by a courier barely an hour after sunrise. Wyatt had not been bluffing from the back of that police cruiser. He had immediately contacted his vicious legal team from his holding cell, activating the predatory clauses of their prenuptial agreement. Camille pushed the papers toward me, her hands shaking violently. "He is taking the clinic, Dad," she whispered, her voice hollow and defeated. He invoked the asset division clause. Because my practice was established after the marriage and funded partially through a joint account, he legally claims 80% ownership. The legal jargon on the page was ruthlessly efficient. Wyatt was aggressively executing a hostile takeover of her veterinary clinic, intending to liquidate the medical equipment, the property lease, and the client database by the end of the business day. He wanted to strip her of her livelihood and leave her completely destitute. This was his scorched earth strategy designed to punish her for my intervention. Camille buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "I built that practice from absolutely nothing," she cried out. "I worked 16-hour shifts, saving animals and building trust in this community." He never contributed a single dime or a single minute of work to that clinic. Now he is going to sell it to a corporate conglomerate for parts. I watched my daughter break down under the crushing weight of legal extortion. Wyatt expected us to panic. He expected us to beg. He expected me to hire an expensive defense attorney and drag this out in family court for years while he suffocated us financially. He was fundamentally underestimating the man standing in his kitchen. I did not offer empty platitudes or panic over the dense legal terminology. I turned my back to the documents and calmly began preparing a pot of black coffee. I measured the grounds with precise, deliberate movements, letting the rhythmic sound of the brewing machine ground my focus. I remembered the exact day Camille introduced me to Wyatt 4 years ago. She was so completely enamored by his polished exterior, his Ivy League credentials, and his generational wealth. She held a stubborn, naive belief that an educated, affluent white man in a tailored suit could never be an abuser. She thought monsters only existed in dark alleys and poverty-stricken neighborhoods. I knew better. I knew that a monster in a boardroom is infinitely more dangerous because society hands him the keys to the castle and calls him a visionary. I handed Camille a warm mug of coffee, placing a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Drink this," I instructed quietly. "Then go take a hot shower. The clinic is not going anywhere." I left her in the kitchen and walked back to my encrypted laptop. Wyatt wanted to play a game of legal asset division. I was going to play a game of forensic financial obliteration. I bypassed the standard banking interfaces and initiated a deep forensic sweep of the veterinary clinic joint operating accounts. A prenuptial agreement is only enforceable if the financial declarations made by both parties are fundamentally honest and legally sound. If I could prove Wyatt had deliberately commingled illicit funds or committed financial fraud using the clinic infrastructure, the entire legal contract would instantly become void under federal law. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, tracing thousands of microtransactions over the past 48 months. I ignored the standard overhead costs and focused entirely on the anomalous outbound wire transfers. Wyatt was an arrogant hedge fund manager who believed he was the smartest man in any room. He assumed a small local veterinary clinic was the perfect low-profile vehicle to wash his dirty money. Within 45 minutes, my algorithms flagged a massive, highly sophisticated discrepancy. Wyatt had systematically siphoned capital from the clinic business account, inflating vendor invoices and masking the stolen funds as payments for specialized medical equipment that never actually existed. The total amount stolen was staggering. He had bled his own wife dry, hiding the theft behind layers of complex corporate accounting that a standard family lawyer would never catch. But I was not a family lawyer. I tracked the stolen capital as it bounced through 3 different international proxy servers before finally settling into an encrypted offshore account in the Cayman Islands. At exactly 10 in the morning, the front doors of the veterinary clinic swung open. Wyatt strode into the reception area, flanked by 2 aggressive-looking court processors and a smug private attorney. He had bailed himself out of jail and changed into a fresh, immaculate tailored suit, completely determined to execute his revenge. The waiting room was empty of clients because I had instructed the staff to lock the doors and stay in the back offices. Wyatt marched directly toward the reception desk, holding a large leather briefcase. "Where is my wife?" he demanded loudly, a triumphant sneer plastered across his face. "Tell her to come out here and hand over the master keys to the building. The asset seizure is officially underway." I stepped out from the hallway leading to the surgical suites, blocking his path. I was holding a single black manila folder. "Camille is not available to speak with you, Wyatt," I stated, my voice perfectly level. "And you are not seizing a single asset from this building today or any other day." Wyatt laughed, a harsh barking sound of pure arrogance. He gestured to the court processors standing behind him. "You do not dictate the law, old man," he mocked. "I have a court-ordered mandate to assume administrative control of this facility. The prenup is ironclad. If you do not hand over the keys right now, I will have these processors authorize a forced entry and you will be arrested for obstruction." I did not move a single inch. I slowly opened the manila folder and extracted a thick stack of printed financial ledgers. I did not hand him the keys. I pressed the cold, hard stack of paper directly against his chest, forcing him to take it. "You are incredibly predictable, Wyatt," I said, lowering my voice to a sharp, deadly register. "You thought you could use this clinic as a personal piggy bank. You fabricated vendor invoices and embezzled exactly $500,000 from the joint operating account over the last 3 years. The moment my words hit the air, Wyatt froze entirely. His triumphant smirk vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He looked down at the ledger in his hands, his eyes darting frantically across the highlighted routing numbers and international IP addresses. "You just violated the core integrity clause of your own prenuptial agreement." I continued pressing my absolute advantage. "Committing federal wire fraud through a marital asset immediately nullifies your claim to the property. But that is not even the most interesting part of this financial puzzle, Wyatt." He stared at me, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. He was completely trapped, and he knew it. I leaned in close, ensuring the court processors behind him could not hear my next words. I traced the final destination of that $500,000, I whispered. "You did not steal that money to fund your own lavish lifestyle. The offshore account in the Cayman Islands receiving the stolen capital does not belong to you. It belongs to Richard Sterling, the billionaire founder of your hedge fund. You are not just a thief, Wyatt. You are an active money mule for your boss. And I just sent this exact ledger to the internal compliance board of your firm. Your career is completely over." Wyatt stared at the ledger in his hands as if the paper itself were laced with lethal poison. The aggressive color completely drained from his face, leaving a sickly pallor behind his perfectly groomed exterior. He slowly backed away from me, colliding with one of the bewildered court processors who had accompanied him to seize the clinic. The realization of what I had just exposed hit him with the force of a freight train. He was not just facing a voided prenuptial agreement or a messy divorce settlement. He was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment for corporate money laundering. I watched his chest heave as panic hijacked his nervous system. Richard Sterling, his billionaire boss, was not a man who tolerated financial exposure. Sterling built his massive hedge fund on absolute secrecy and ruthless efficiency. Wyatt knew exactly what happens to a money mule who leaves a digital trail leading straight back to the corporate throne room. His phone suddenly vibrated in his jacket pocket, slicing through the tense silence of the reception area. Wyatt pulled it out with trembling fingers. I could clearly see the caller ID flashing on the screen. It was Sterling. The federal freeze I had initiated on Wyatt's accounts earlier that morning had finally triggered the internal security protocols at the hedge fund. The untouchable billionaire was demanding an immediate explanation for the frozen offshore capital. Wyatt did not answer the call. He rejected it, shoving the phone back into his pocket with erratic, terrified movements. He looked at the court processors and shouted for them to leave the building immediately. The hostile takeover of Camille's veterinary clinic was officially aborted. He grabbed his leather briefcase and bolted through the glass doors, sprinting toward his luxury car like a hunted animal. I locked the clinic doors the moment his car sped out of the parking lot and walked directly into the back office to open my encrypted laptop. Wyatt was running, but I was already 10 steps ahead, orchestrating the exact trajectory of his downfall. I bypassed standard internet protocols and routed my connection straight into the dark web, accessing a secure, hidden terminal I had maintained for over a decade. Throughout my 30-year career at the Treasury Department, I hunted the most dangerous financial predators on the planet. People constantly assume that street-level criminals are the hardest targets to track. That is a massive misconception. Street thugs operate in cash, keep their circles tight, and leave very little documentation. Men in expensive tailored suits like Wyatt and Richard Sterling are infinitely sloppier. White-collar criminals absolutely rely on the illusion of corporate legitimacy to protect themselves. They hide behind layers of shell companies, offshore trusts, and an army of high-priced lawyers, assuming the complexity of their transactions will deter any serious investigation. But money always leaves a trace, and arrogance makes them lazy. They reuse the same proxy servers, they repeat their fraudulent routing numbers, and they blindly trust digital encryption that I helped design. I deployed a specialized data extraction algorithm, ripping through the hedge fund's internal communication networks. I compiled a devastating master file containing every single wire transfer, every falsified vendor invoice, and every encrypted email Wyatt sent to Sterling over the past 3 years. I did not just have proof of the $500,000 embezzled from my daughter's clinic. I had irrefutable evidence of a massive multi-million-dollar money laundering syndicate operating right under the noses of federal regulators. I organized the data into a perfectly structured forensic report highlighting the exact federal statutes they had violated. I stripped all metadata from the file, ensuring my digital fingerprints were entirely erased. I was not going to hand this over to local law enforcement. Local cops can be bought, delayed, or confused by expensive defense attorneys. I was going to drop a nuclear bomb directly onto the corporate boardroom and watch them cannibalize their own to survive. I prepared an anonymous, untraceable email attaching the comprehensive master file and set the recipient list to include every single member of the hedge fund's board of directors. I also carbon copied the firm's chief compliance officer and their external independent auditors. There would be absolutely no way for Sterling to quietly sweep this under the rug or silence the board. The sheer volume of undeniable evidence would trigger mandatory reporting protocols, forcing the firm to self-destruct in order to comply with federal regulations. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, confirming the payload was fully weaponized. I pressed the enter key, executing the transmission. The untraceable email vanished into the encrypted network, delivering the lethal forensic report instantly to the most powerful corporate executives in the city. I leaned back in the office chair, monitoring the live corporate server traffic through a backdoor port. The reaction was instantaneous and violently chaotic. Within exactly 4 minutes, the internal communication channels at the hedge fund exploded. Board members began frantically initiating emergency video conferences. The compliance department triggered an immediate lockdown of all external trading protocols. Wyatt was driving frantically trying to salvage his shattered reality when the corporate guillotine fell. I tapped into his mobile carrier signal, intercepting his incoming communications. His phone rang incessantly. The head of human resources sent an automated voice message informing him that his employment was terminated with immediate cause. Every single stock option, unvested bonus, and corporate benefit he possessed was instantly revoked under the gross misconduct clauses of his contract. 2 minutes later, an email arrived from the firm's elite legal defense team advising him that they no longer represented his interests and instructing him not to contact the office or any affiliated personnel. He was completely excommunicated. His corporate empire crumbled into absolute dust before he even reached the city limits. Wyatt had spent his entire life leveraging his status and his wealth to manipulate those around him. He used his position to terrorize my daughter and mock my existence. Now he had absolutely nothing. No job, no money, no legal protection, and no powerful allies. He was entirely radioactive. The billionaire boss he had blindly served had instantly cut him loose, offering him up as a sacrificial lamb to appease the inevitable federal inquiries. The ultimate predator was now completely isolated and stripped of his fangs. But a cornered rat is highly unpredictable, and Wyatt was rapidly losing his grip on sanity. He realized that without his corporate shield, he was facing decades in federal prison. He could not outrun the evidence I had unleashed. He needed leverage. He needed a hostage valuable enough to force me to pull back the dogs and dismantle the forensic traps I had set. I watched his GPS signal veer violently off the highway, heading in a completely unexpected direction. He was not driving to his lawyer or a safe house. He was making a desperate, unhinged play for survival. I tracked his vehicle speed as he recklessly ran red lights and tore through suburban intersections. The geographic coordinates updating on my screen sent a sudden, terrifying chill directly through my veins. He was driving straight to the private kindergarten where Camille's 4-year-old son was currently enrolled. Wyatt was completely erratic, entirely stripped of his rationale and operating purely on survival panic. He pulled into the school parking lot, leaving his car idling on the curb. He marched into the administrative office, waving a stack of freshly forged emergency custody documents demanding the immediate release of his child. He intended to kidnap his own son and use the boy as the ultimate bargaining chip to extort a ransom and force my compliance. The kindergarten staff hesitated, confused by his aggressive tone. Wyatt slammed his fist against the reception desk, screaming that his wife was having a mental breakdown. He thought he could outmaneuver me by targeting the most vulnerable member of my family. The ultimate line had just been crossed. Wyatt slammed his fist against the reinforced glass of the reception desk, demanding the immediate release of his 4-year-old son. The heavy thud made the receptionist jump. He shoved the freshly forged emergency custody documents under the communication slot, his voice vibrating with manufactured panic and aggressive authority. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, recoiled from the sudden violent outburst. Wyatt leaned closer, leveraging his tailored suit and his affluent white executive persona to completely intimidate her. He claimed Camille was suffering a severe psychotic break and that the child was in imminent mortal danger if he did not take him right this second. He spoke with the commanding entitlement of a man who fully expected the world to bend to his will regardless of the rules or the collateral damage. Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling as she looked over the official-looking legal papers. The documents were flawless forgeries, complete with counterfeit judicial signatures and fake emergency court seals that Wyatt had procured through his shady corporate fixers. Wyatt barked a harsh command telling her to bypass the standard security protocols and retrieve the boy from the playground immediately. He threatened to sue the school board and have her personally fired if she delayed him by a single minute. He was playing the role of the desperate protective father, with terrifying precision, masking his true intentions behind a wall of arrogant privilege. His eyes darted toward the interior hallway, expecting to see his son walking out ready to be snatched and used as the ultimate bargaining chip against me. He believed his sheer audacity would overwhelm the civilian staff and grant him the hostage he desperately needed to leverage his freedom and force my total surrender. Wyatt did not realize I had completely anticipated his desperate pivot. The moment his vehicle veered off the highway, I mapped his trajectory and took an aggressive, calculated shortcut through the industrial district, avoiding the main traffic arteries. I arrived at the kindergarten exactly 10 minutes before his tires hit the parking lot curb. I had already spoken directly with the school director, locked down the entire educational facility, and secured my grandson safely inside the fortified inner administrative office. Wyatt was screaming at a receptionist who had already been explicitly instructed to stall him and keep his attention strictly focused on the front desk. I stepped out from the administration hallway directly behind him. The heavy wooden security door closed with a sharp click, cutting off his escape route into the interior of the school. Wyatt spun around, his eyes wide with frantic disbelief as he saw me standing there, blocking the only path to his son. He looked me up and down, expecting to see the frail, crippled old man he had mocked at the Thanksgiving table for 4 consecutive years. He expected a weak postal worker who needed a cane to navigate a simple flight of stairs. He was entirely blind to reality. The pronounced limp, the hunched shoulders, and the slow, deliberate movements were a carefully constructed physical masquerade. I designed that harmless facade to ensure men exactly like Wyatt never saw me as a physical threat until it was entirely too late. The absolute truth is, I spend 2 grueling hours every single morning inside my reinforced garage brutalizing heavy punching bags and deadlifting raw iron. I maintained the peak physical conditioning required of a federal operative operating in hostile, unpredictable territories. My body is a hardened weapon hidden beneath loose-fitting cardigans and orthopedic shoes. I dropped the hunch instantly. I straightened my spine, expanding my chest to its full imposing breadth, and stood at my true height. The physical transformation was immediate and terrifying to witness. I towered over him, radiating the lethal, cold-blooded presence of a seasoned apex predator who had spent decades hunting the most dangerous men on the planet. Wyatt took a small, involuntary step backward. His forged document slipped from his sweating hands and scattered across the reception floor. "You are not taking my grandson anywhere, Wyatt." I stated, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any human warmth. "Your hostage negotiation ends right here and right now." Wyatt snapped completely under the crushing pressure of his ruined life. His polished corporate intellect vanished entirely, replaced by the raw, feral panic of a cornered animal fighting for basic survival. He lunged forward, swinging a wild, desperate fist aimed directly at my jaw. He actually believed his youth and his expensive country club tennis muscles gave him a distinct physical advantage over a retired black postal worker whom he considered physically inferior. He was disastrously wrong. I did not flinch, retreat, or raise my voice. I stepped smoothly inside his wide, uncoordinated arc, blocking his strike with absolute minimal effort. Before he could retract his arm, I shot my right hand forward and seized his wrist with the crushing, unforgiving force of an industrial vice. I twisted his arm sharply upward, locking his joint into a highly painful submission hold, and drove him backward straight through the heavy double glass doors of the reception area. We spilled out onto the concrete walkway, the cold morning air hitting us instantly. I maintained my punishing grip, marching him forcibly across the asphalt parking lot until we reached his idling luxury sedan. I slammed his chest violently against the hood of the car, pinning him down with the sheer weight of my upper body leverage. The metal groaned under the sudden impact. Wyatt gasped in agonizing pain, his knees buckling as the targeted pressure on his trapped wrist threatened to snap the bone entirely. "Let me go." He choked out, his face pressed hard against the cold metal of the vehicle, his breath fogging the polished paint. I leaned in close, my voice a deadly whisper right next to his ear. "I warned you about crossing the line and targeting my family." I reached into my coat pocket with my free hand and pulled out a thick bound envelope containing his financial death sentence. I dropped it directly onto the back of his head, letting it slide down and land heavily on the hood beside his face. "Those are the original, unredacted embezzlement files, Wyatt. Every single fraudulent transaction you made stealing from my daughter and washing dirty money for Richard Sterling is meticulously documented right there. The federal authorities already have the digital copies sitting on their desks, but I thought you should keep the physical receipts to review while you await your upcoming criminal trial." I released my crushing grip on his wrist and shoved him roughly toward the driver's side door. "Run, Wyatt," I commanded, coldly stepping back to give him room to flee. "Run as fast and as far as you can before the federal agents arrive." Wyatt scrambled wildly into the driver's seat, clutching his severely bruised arm to his chest. He slammed the car into gear and sped out of the parking lot, burning rubber as he fled the scene in absolute terror. I stood motionless on the pavement, watching his taillights disappear down the quiet suburban street. My phone actively intercepted the outgoing cellular signal from his vehicle, bridging the audio directly into my secure earpiece. He was not calling his high-priced lawyer or his former billionaire boss. He was calling the one man left who possessed the absolute political power to shield him from federal annihilation. "Dad." He sobbed into the phone, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "I need your help right now. They took everything from me today." The deep voice on the other end belonged to State Senator Harlan Kensington. The war had just officially escalated from corporate fraud to untouchable white-collar political power. Senator Harlan Kensington did not waste a single second after receiving that desperate phone call from his fugitive son. He operated with the ruthless efficiency of a deeply entrenched politician who understood exactly how to manipulate the public narrative to protect his legacy. By 6 o'clock the following morning, my phone was vibrating relentlessly with alerts from local and state news aggregators. I opened the browser to find a massive front-page editorial published by the most widely circulated and politically influential newspaper in the state. The headline was a masterpiece of character assassination and racial dog whistling. It framed the entire situation as an unprovoked violent assault on a prominent, respectable white executive by an unstable former government employee. The article heavily implied I possessed a criminal history, painting me as an aggressive black man suffering from severe psychological trauma who had violently terrorized a peaceful suburban neighborhood. Harlan had utilized his extensive media contacts to completely bypass the actual police reports and bury the truth under a mountain of carefully crafted slander. The journalist conveniently omitted Wyatt's embezzlement, his massive debt, and his unhinged attempt to kidnap my grandson. Instead, they included a highly edited photograph of me being briefly handcuffed in Wyatt's living room, capturing the exact moment I looked dangerous and uncooperative. The narrative was expertly designed to destroy my credibility before any federal indictment could be officially unsealed against his son. Harlan was deploying his ultimate political weapon, assuming I would react with the typical outrage and defensive panic of a marginalized citizen fighting a rigged system. He expected me to call a press conference or hire a civil rights attorney to loudly protest my innocence in the court of public opinion. He assumed I would play the victim. Camille sat at the kitchen table staring at the digital article on her tablet with tears streaming down her face. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the vicious comment section where hundreds of anonymous readers were already demanding my immediate incarceration and calling our entire family a disgrace. She looked up at me, completely devastated by the sheer speed and cruelty of the political smear campaign. "Dad, they are destroying us," she whispered, her voice cracking under the intense emotional weight. "They are making you look like a monster and everyone is believing them. We have to release a statement or call the police to correct the record." I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of frustration. I gently took the tablet from her trembling hands and placed it face down on the counter. "Do not waste your energy crying over a fabricated narrative," Camille, I stated with absolute calm. "You never fight the press with anger or public outrage. You fight the press with capital." I walked directly to my encrypted laptop and booted up my primary financial tracking software. During my 30 years hunting global syndicates, I learned a fundamental truth about media empires. Journalists write the stories, but creditors dictate the survival of the publication. I targeted the parent company of the newspaper that published the defamatory article. It was a legacy media conglomerate that had been quietly bleeding revenue for the past 5 years, struggling to compete in the digital age. They were desperately keeping their doors open by relying on a massive line of revolving credit from a regional commercial bank. I ran a forensic diagnostic on their outstanding liabilities and found exactly what I needed to execute my counterstrike. The media outlet was holding exactly $4 million in toxic bad debt categorized as high risk by their primary lender. The bank was actively seeking to offload this non-performing asset to any private equity firm willing to purchase the debt for pennies on the dollar to clear their internal financial records before the upcoming federal auditing quarter. Senator Harlan Kensington arrogantly believed his established political influence made him completely untouchable in this major city. He fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamics of modern capitalism. A state senator can ask a newspaper for a favor, but the entity that holds the debt completely owns the newspaper. I routed $500,000 from my untraceable offshore operational funds through Apex Holdings. Within 45 minutes, I executed a rapid, aggressive, and completely hostile buyout of the media conglomerate's entire debt portfolio. I was no longer the target of their journalism. I was officially their primary creditor, holding the absolute power to force them into immediate bankruptcy and legally liquidate their entire operational infrastructure before the very end of the current business day. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct private extension of the newspaper's editor-in-chief. I did not bother going through the reception desk or the legal department. The line rang twice before a highly arrogant voice answered, barking his name impatiently, expecting a call from a political ally or a subordinate. I did not introduce myself. I spoke with the lethal authority of a man holding a loaded financial weapon directly to his corporate head. You have exactly 3 minutes to pull the defamatory article regarding Dominic Rollins from every single digital platform you control, I stated coldly. The editor let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, clearly unaccustomed to receiving direct threats on his private line. I do not know who the hell you think you are, but we do not retract verified journalism based on threatening phone calls, he snapped. I did not raise my voice. I am the senior managing director of Apex Holdings, I replied, letting the name of the shell company hang in the air. At exactly 9 this morning, my firm purchased the entirety of your $4 million bad debt portfolio from your primary lender. If that article is not completely scrubbed from the internet in the next 180 seconds, I am going to call in the entirety of the debt. You do not have the liquidity to cover it. I will force your publication into immediate Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I will personally ensure the doors are padlocked. Your assets are liquidated, and your entire editorial staff is standing in the unemployment line by Friday afternoon. The confident arrogance vanished from the line, instantly replaced by the rapid, shallow breathing of a man realizing his entire career was evaporating. Wait, please let us discuss this, he stammered, his voice pitching high with sudden terror. You have 2 minutes and 40 seconds left, I replied and terminated the call. I stood beside Camille and watched the screen of my laptop. Exactly 2 minutes and 12 seconds later, the vicious hit piece completely vanished from the website. A standard error page briefly appeared before refreshing into a highly visible, formal public apology. The new headline completely retracted the previous statement, citing severe editorial oversight and formally apologizing to the Rollins family for the unjust and fabricated allegations. Camille stared at the screen in absolute disbelief, watching the total eradication of the smear campaign happen in real time. She let out a long, trembling sigh of relief, finally believing that we had successfully neutralized the political power of the Kensington family. She stood up to wrap her arms around me, but before she could take a single step forward, 3 loud, aggressive knocks hammered against our front door. The heavy rhythmic pounding was not the polite knock of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was the synchronized, authoritative knock of government officials expecting immediate entry. I walked to the security monitor and checked the exterior camera feed. 2 individuals in formal state employee jackets were standing on the porch holding thick clipboards accompanied by a uniformed police officer. They were not federal agents investigating Wyatt. They were state agents deployed by Senator Harlan. He had realized his media strategy failed and immediately pivoted to his most cruel and devastating political weapon. It was Child Protective Services dispatched with an emergency court order to legally strip Camille of her child. I opened the front door to find 3 people standing on the porch. The uniformed police officer kept his hand resting casually near his utility belt, while the 2 state agents stepped forward. The lead agent was a stern-looking white woman with a severely clipped haircut and a prominent state identification badge hanging from her neck. Her name was Brenda Vargas, and she did not bother with formal introductions or polite pleasantries. She immediately shoved a thick clipboard toward my chest, attempting to physically push past me into the living room. "We are here from Child Protective Services on an emergency mandate," she declared, her voice loud and deliberately aggressive. "We received multiple verified reports of severe domestic instability, substance abuse, and an actively hostile environment threatening the welfare of a minor child in this residence. We have a court order to conduct an immediate home inspection and, if necessary, remove the child into state custody." Camille gasped from behind me, her hands flying to her mouth in absolute horror. The threat of losing her son was the ultimate nightmare weaponized against her by the Kensington family. Brenda sneered at my daughter, her eyes scanning the foyer looking for any excuse to document a violation. Senator Harlan had undoubtedly paid her handsomely to fabricate a crisis. She expected us to panic, to scream about our rights, or to physically resist the inspection, which would instantly give the police officer the legal justification to arrest me and allow her to take my grandson. I did not move a single inch from the doorway. I stood like a massive, solid brick wall, completely blocking her direct line of sight into the interior of our house. "You are not crossing this threshold, Brenda." I stated, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any visible intimidation. Brenda scoffed, attempting to leverage her state authority. "You do not have a choice, old man," she snapped, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. "If you obstruct a state welfare investigation, I will have this officer place you in handcuffs, and I will take the child right now." She was leaning entirely on the institutional power of her badge, assuming her political backing made her completely untouchable. She was making a catastrophic miscalculation. 5 years ago, during my tenure at the Treasury Department, I led a highly classified federal audit focusing on municipal corruption within this exact state district. Child welfare departments are notoriously underfunded, but I noticed a glaring financial anomaly in their administrative overhead. I spent 6 months tracing the invisible capital flowing through their systems, and I uncovered a massive, highly organized bribery ring. Corrupt agents were intentionally fast-tracking custody battles for wealthy families, burying legitimate abuse reports and facilitating illicit adoptions in exchange for massive, off-the-books kickbacks. Brenda Vargas was not just a low-level field worker. She was one of the primary architects of that exact slush fund. The federal government never formally prosecuted that specific bribery ring because we utilized the financial data to pursue much larger transnational targets, instead leaving corrupt operatives like Brenda completely unaware that their entire illicit financial history was securely stored on my encrypted hard drives. I knew everything about her. I knew precisely how she washed her dirty money through phony consulting firms registered in the Bahamas. I knew the exact dates she received wire transfers from the Kensington Political Action Committee. I did not need to argue with her about the cleanliness of my daughter's home or present photographic evidence of Wyatt's physical abuse. Engaging with a corrupt system on its own terms is a guaranteed way to lose. You bypass the system entirely by destroying the individual operating it. I maintained my absolute block on the doorway, crossing my arms over my chest. I looked at the police officer standing behind her. "Officer, I suggest you step back down the porch stairs," I instructed calmly. "What is about to happen here does not require law enforcement intervention." The officer frowned, but something in my authoritative tone made him hesitate and take a slow step backward. I returned my gaze to Brenda. "You do not have a verified report of instability," I told her, lowering my voice so only she could hear the lethal precision of my words. "You have a direct order from Senator Harlan Kensington to manufacture a crisis. But you are going to turn around, walk back to your vehicle, and permanently close this file right now, immediately." Brenda let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Are you threatening a state agent?" she demanded, attempting to raise her voice to draw the police officer back into the confrontation. I did not raise my voice in return. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small silver USB drive. I held it up between us, letting the morning light catch the metal. "I am not threatening you, Brenda," I replied, my tone dropping into a deadly whisper. "I am offering you a choice between early retirement and federal prison." I slid the USB drive smoothly into the front pocket of her state-issued jacket. That drive does not contain security footage of Wyatt Kensington assaulting his wife. It contains something much more dangerous to your personal freedom. It contains the complete, unredacted transaction history of a shell company named Vargas Consulting operating out of Nassau. It details the exact routing numbers of your offshore accounts and the corresponding deposits made by the Kensington Political Action Committee over the last 36 months. I watched her face as the blood completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her deathly pale. The arrogant sneer vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. Her breathing hitched and her eyes darted frantically around the porch, suddenly terrified of who might be watching or listening. "The documents on that drive have already been compiled into a formal federal indictment package," I continued, tightening the psychological noose. "If you take one more step toward my daughter or my grandson, I will press send on an email to the Department of Justice. You will be arrested for extortion, child endangerment, and wire fraud before you finish your lunch break." Brenda stood completely paralyzed. She understood with absolute certainty that I possessed the power to destroy her entire life. She took a slow, trembling step backward, practically stumbling over her own feet. "There has been a massive misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "The anonymous report we received appears to be completely unfounded. This residence is perfectly safe. We are closing the file immediately." She dropped her clipboard, turned around, and practically sprinted back to her state vehicle, leaving the confused police officer scrambling to follow her rapidly retreating footsteps. I watched the corrupt system completely collapse under the undeniable weight of its own documented corporate greed right in front of me. Camille collapsed against the foyer wall, letting out a massive breath of relief as the state vehicles sped rapidly away from our house. The immediate threat to her child was entirely neutralized, but I knew the war was far from over. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt, my mind already calculating the next inevitable escalation. Senator Harlan Kensington was sitting in his lavish political office eagerly expecting a phone call confirming the successful abduction of his grandson. Instead, he received a frantic, terrifying report from his most reliable corrupt asset, stating that the operation was completely aborted and that his own illicit financial ties were severely compromised. Harlan finally realized the absolute truth. He was not dealing with a fragile retired postal worker or an ordinary angry father. He was dealing with a highly sophisticated adversary capable of systematically dismantling his political weapons in a matter of minutes. My cell phone vibrated violently on the kitchen counter. I picked it up to see a blocked number. I answered without hesitation. "We need to talk, Dominic," a deep, furious voice demanded. I recognized the voice instantly. Senator Harlan Kensington spoke with the arrogant, gravelly cadence of a man who spent his entire life dictating terms to his inferiors. "We need to talk, Dominic." He repeated his tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Meet me at the Oak Ridge Country Club in exactly 1 hour. Tell the gate guard you are my guest. Do not be late." The line went dead. He did not ask for my availability or consider my terms. He simply commanded. I placed the phone on the counter and buttoned my cheap faded cardigan. The Oak Ridge Country Club was a notorious bastion of generational wealth and old white money. It was a sprawling, heavily fortified estate where the city elite gathered to smoke imported cigars and casually carve up the local economy behind closed doors. Harlan chose this specific location for a very deliberate psychological reason. He wanted to strip me of my home field advantage. He intended to drag me into a hostile environment where his power was absolute and my presence was a glaring anomaly designed to make me feel small and entirely out of place. I drove my beat-up 2005 Honda Accord through the towering wrought iron gates of the club. The uniformed valet attendants stared openly at my vehicle, their expressions a mix of confusion and utter disdain. I parked the car myself, ignoring their judgmental whispers. I walked through the massive oak double doors into the grand lobby. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over mahogany paneling and antique leather chairs. Every single patron in the room was white wealthy and radiating an aura of untouchable privilege. Conversations literally paused as I walked past them. I ignored the hostile stares. I found Senator Harlan sitting alone at a secluded table in the far corner of the dining room. Senator Harlan Kensington was nursing a glass of expensive bourbon when I approached the table. He wore a flawless, bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than my entire vehicle. He did not stand up to greet me or offer his hand. He simply gestured to the empty chair across from him with a flick of his wrist. I sat down, smoothing the lapels of my worn-out, off-the-rack suit jacket. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, a deliberate wardrobe choice I maintained for situations exactly like this one. Harlan looked me up and down, a patronizing smirk twisting the corners of his mouth. "I must admit, Dominic, I am surprised they let you pass the front gate," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We rarely see men of your particular background inside these walls. I hope the sheer elegance of the establishment is not making you feel too uncomfortable." I did not react to the blatant racial dog whistle or the petty class insult. I remained perfectly still, maintaining steady, unbroken eye contact. Throughout my decades interrogating financial criminals at the Treasury Department, I developed a psychological technique that never failed. I thrive when arrogant men underestimate my intellect based on my physical appearance or my racial identity. When powerful men believe they are vastly superior, they become incredibly reckless. They talk too much. They broadcast their deepest insecurities, assuming the person sitting across from them lacks the capacity to understand their maneuvers. I simply sat there and let Harlan fill the silence. "I want to be perfectly clear about why you are here," Harlan continued, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. "My son made some highly regrettable financial errors. He got sloppy. I am fully aware that you somehow stumbled upon his corporate misdeeds and used that stolen information to terrorize him last night. You even managed to spook a state welfare agent. I will admit you are quite resourceful for a retired postal worker. But your lucky streak ends right here and right now. You are swimming in an ocean entirely filled with great white sharks, Dominic. You do not have the political connections, the financial backing, or the legal stamina to survive a prolonged war against my family." I watched the slight tremor in his hands and the nervous, rapid blinking of his eyes. He was projecting absolute dominance, but his physical tells revealed raw, desperate panic. He was terrified. He needed this situation buried permanently before it contaminated his political legacy and destroyed his upcoming re-election campaign. He was a bleeding predator hiding behind wealth. Harlan reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a crisp, pristine piece of paper. He placed it face down on the table and slowly slid it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of me. "I am a pragmatic man, Dominic," he stated smoothly, his confidence seemingly restored by the introduction of capital. "I understand that your daughter feels wronged, and I understand that you feel protective. But revenge does not pay the mortgage or fund a college education for your grandson. That is a certified cashier check. It is made out to your daughter for exactly $2 million tax-free." Harlan leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands together in a steepled gesture of finality. "All you have to do is take that check and walk away. You will sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. You will surrender all financial documents regarding my son. You will completely drop all police reports, and you will grant Wyatt full unsupervised visitation rights. You take the money, you buy a nice little house in a quiet neighborhood, and you never speak the name Kensington ever again. Do we have a deal?" I looked down at the check. $2 million was a staggering amount of money for a normal civilian. It was designed to be an absolute irresistible temptation. I did not reach for the paper. I did not even flinch. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my cheap frayed suit jacket and pulled out a thick-bound manila folder. I placed it directly on top of his certified check and pushed both items back across the table until they rested directly in front of him. Harlan frowned, staring at the folder. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice losing its polished edge. I kept my voice perfectly flat and deadly calm. "That is a comprehensive forensic analysis of your illegal campaign slush funds, Harlan. It contains the exact routing numbers for the offshore shell companies you use to accept massive corporate bribes. It details every single federal election finance law you have violated over the past decade." Harlan stared at the folder in absolute frozen horror. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "I am not here for your money, Harlan," I whispered coldly. "I am the architect of your downfall." Harlan's face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The polished veneer of the untouchable state senator shattered, completely exposing the feral, desperate criminal underneath. The blood rushed to his cheeks, turning his skin a mottled, furious purple, as he realized his political empire was entirely compromised. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling his expensive bourbon glass, but I was already walking away. I strode out of the exclusive country club, leaving him suffocating in his own impending destruction. I climbed into my old Honda Accord and drove out through the towering iron gates into the darkening evening. The suburban roads were quiet and empty as the sun dipped completely below the horizon. I watched the rearview mirror out of habit. Two blindingly bright high beams suddenly appeared out of the darkness, closing the distance behind me at an aggressive, unnatural speed. A massive, heavy-duty truck accelerated violently, refusing to brake. The truck deliberately rammed the rear bumper of my Honda at full speed, sending my car spinning wildly out of control into the dark, deadly intersection. The brutal impact of the heavy-duty truck slamming forcefully into the rear of my Honda sent a violent shockwave tearing through my spine. The horrific sound of crunching metal and shattering glass filled the small cabin as my vehicle was violently propelled into the dark, empty intersection. The outside world spun in a chaotic blur of streetlights and asphalt as the tires lost all traction. The steering wheel jerked violently out of my grip. My car collided heavily against a reinforced concrete traffic barrier, violently halting the uncontrollable spin. The airbags deployed instantly with a concussive blast, punching the breath completely out of my lungs. White smoke and the acrid smell of leaking, burning engine fluid instantly flooded the interior. Through the cracked driver's side window, I saw the massive black silhouette of the heavy-duty truck pause for a fraction of a second. The anonymous driver did not step out to check the smoking wreckage. He had executed a calculated, targeted hit. Having confirmed the catastrophic damage to my vehicle, the driver aggressively shifted gears and sped off into the night, leaving me for dead alone in the crushed remains of my car. Senator Harlan Kensington had officially escalated his political war into a direct assassination attempt. He truly believed he had permanently eliminated the only obstacle standing between his corrupt empire and complete federal exposure. He assumed a 69-year-old man would simply perish inside the mangled steel tomb. He thought he had successfully silenced the architect of his downfall, ending the threat to his family legacy and finally securing his son's absolute freedom. Harlan was resting comfortably in his sprawling estate, entirely convinced that the problem of Dominic Rollins was decisively and permanently solved. He was catastrophically wrong about my mortality and my resolve. Blood dripped steadily from a deep laceration across my forehead, temporarily blinding my left eye. The driver's side door was completely crushed inward, trapping my legs beneath the buckled dashboard. Bright orange flames flickered beneath the crumpled hood of the Honda, threatening to ignite the leaking fuel lines at any moment. I did not panic or surrender to the excruciating physical agony radiating through my battered body. During my early years investigating cartel supply chains, I endured severe tactical interrogations that conditioned my mind to compartmentalize severe physical trauma. Pain is simply a temporary biological signal designed to warn you. It absolutely does not dictate your action. It only sharpens focus and eliminates any lingering hesitation. I reached up and wiped the warm blood from my vision, my mind operating with absolute clinical precision. I braced my back firmly against the crushed driver's seat, raised both of my heavy boots, and kicked violently against the shattered web of the windshield. The safety glass groaned, but held. I inhaled deeply, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain of 2 fractured ribs, and kicked a second time with maximum lethal force. The entire windshield gave way, shattering outward onto the cold pavement. I dragged my battered body through the narrow opening, scraping my arms and chest against the jagged edges of broken glass. I collapsed onto the asphalt just as the engine block erupted into a massive ball of searing flames, consuming the entire vehicle in a violent, fiery inferno. I slowly pushed myself up from the freezing street, leaning heavily against a nearby street lamp. The searing heat of the burning car warmed my bleeding face. Watching the flames destroy my modest vehicle, a profound fundamental shift occurred within my mind. I had spent the last 48 hours playing a strategic defensive game, prioritizing my daughter's safety and attempting to legally corner the Kensington family. That strategy ended the exact moment Harlan tried to put me in a body bag. I was no longer interested in preserving their political reputation or allowing the federal justice system to handle their prosecution at a slow, bureaucratic pace. I decided to completely abandon any defensive posturing. It was finally time to aggressively burn their entire house down. I took a secure burner phone from my coat pocket and dialed a trusted medical contact who operated a discreet private clinic. I required immediate stitches and pain management, but I absolutely refused to enter a public hospital where my survival could be documented and reported back to Harlan. I urgently needed the state senator to confidently step onto a public stage tomorrow morning, entirely convinced that I was completely dead. He truly needed to feel untouchable before I publicly destroyed him. The following afternoon, Senator Harlan Kensington hosted a massive, highly publicized press conference at the downtown Civic Center. He was standing behind a polished mahogany podium, delivering a passionate televised speech focused entirely on traditional family values and community safety. Local and state news television cameras actively broadcast his arrogant face live across countless nationwide networks. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, radiating the smug, untouchable confidence of a corrupt politician who believed he had successfully ordered the execution of his primary adversary the night before. Harlan spoke eloquently about the importance of protecting vulnerable citizens, completely unaware that the very man he tried to murder was walking directly toward his stage. I confidently entered the packed Civic Center through the main double doors, moving with a slow, deliberate physical dominance that commanded instant attention. I wore my best dark suit over my bandaged ribs. A stark white medical bandage was wrapped tightly around my forehead, covering the deep laceration from the brutal car crash. I did not attempt to hide my injuries. I wore them as a highly visible testament to his failed assassination attempt. The large crowd of reporters and political supporters naturally parted as I marched steadily down the center aisle. I finally stopped walking when I reached the absolute front row, standing less than 10 feet away from the podium. I stood perfectly still, crossing my arms over my chest, and securely locked my cold, unyielding gaze directly onto Harlan. He was in the middle of a rehearsed sentence about moral integrity when his eyes finally scanned the front row and landed on my heavily bandaged face. The arrogant political smile instantly vanished from his lips. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Harlan completely lost his ability to speak. He gripped the edges of the heavy wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He opened his mouth repeatedly, but no coherent sound emerged. The powerful, untouchable senator began to violently stammer and choke on his own words right in front of the flashing cameras. He began sweating profusely, utterly paralyzed by the sudden terrifying realization that the stubborn ghost he thought he successfully killed was standing right in front of him. His highly televised political triumph transformed into a humiliating public breakdown as he stared into the unblinking eyes of the man orchestrating his absolute ruin. Miles away from the Civic Center, a desperate and increasingly erratic Wyatt Kensington was sitting in a cheap motel room frantically watching his father's live political broadcast on a small television screen. When the camera angle suddenly shifted to show my bandaged face standing in the front row, Wyatt let out a terrified scream. He watched his powerful father completely crumble on national television, realizing that their entire family dynasty was facing imminent destruction. Panic completely overrode his rational judgment. He knew he could not run without a massive infusion of cash or serious leverage. Believing I was entirely distracted at the Civic Center, Wyatt made a catastrophic decision. He violently kicked in the front door of my old and heavily secured downtown apartment. He started frantically tearing through my personal belongings, desperately searching for any hidden files, physical blackmail material, or cash reserves he could use to negotiate his survival. He carelessly ripped apart heavy drawers and threw large furniture aside, completely unaware that my old apartment was never empty. He was walking entirely blindly into a highly meticulously designed forensic trap. Wyatt kicked the splintered door of my old downtown apartment wide open, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. He did not care about the noise or the neighbors. He was a drowning man looking for a life raft, convinced that my modest living space held the absolute key to his salvation. He frantically tore through the living room, flipping over the modest sofa cushions and sweeping the minimal decor off the shelves. He marched into my small home office and began violently pulling out desk drawers, dumping stacks of mundane utility bills and blank paper onto the floor. His hands were shaking as he ripped apart the lining of my mattress and completely emptied the closet, throwing my cheap, frayed cardigans across the room. He was searching for cash, hidden hard drives, or anything he could leverage to buy his way out of federal prison. After 20 minutes of destructive, panicked searching, his eyes locked onto a small, heavy steel lockbox bolted to the bottom shelf of the bedroom closet. Wyatt grabbed a heavy hammer from my kitchen and smashed the lock repeatedly until the metal hinge finally snapped. He pried the lid open, his eyes widening with greedy anticipation. Inside the box rested a single thick, leather-bound black book. He pulled it out, his fingers tracing the smooth cover. He flipped it open, scanning the columns of handwritten names, dates offshore, routing numbers, and massive financial figures. A sickening smile of pure triumph spread across his sweating face. In his arrogant, frantic mind, he had just discovered the ultimate leverage. He believed he had uncovered my master client list, a comprehensive physical ledger detailing the illicit financial transactions of the world's most dangerous criminals and corrupt politicians. He thought he had finally found his golden ticket to freedom. I sat quietly in the sterile examination room of the private medical clinic while a trusted surgeon meticulously stitched the deep laceration across my forehead. My encrypted smartphone rested on the stainless steel tray beside me, actively streaming the live high-definition video feed from my old apartment. I watched Wyatt tear my former residence completely apart with the detached and analytical focus of a scientist observing a desperate rat navigate a maze. He operated entirely on predictable desperation. During my extensive career investigating transnational money laundering syndicates and highly organized financial crimes, I developed a strict operational protocol regarding my personal security. I never abandoned a residence without leaving behind a meticulously constructed honey trap. A honey trap is an intelligence-gathering technique designed to attract, ensnare, and ultimately destroy any unauthorized adversary foolish enough to trespass. I completely understood the psychological profile of men like Wyatt Kensington. They are fundamentally driven by an insatiable, blinding greed. They always believe they are the smartest operators in any given scenario, and they invariably assume their enemies possess the exact same vulnerabilities they do. Wyatt naturally assumed that an elite forensic auditor would maintain a physical failsafe, a tangible black book containing highly classified blackmail material hidden away in a secondary location. He projected his own corrupt corporate methodology onto my life. The leather-bound black book he was holding with such absolute reverence was entirely a fabrication. I spent 3 painstaking weeks crafting that specific ledger. I filled its pages with completely fictitious offshore accounts, randomized routing numbers, and entirely made-up transactional data carefully engineered to look incredibly authentic to the untrained eye. It was essentially a masterpiece of psychological bait designed specifically for greedy, arrogant idiots who lack the technical expertise to verify raw financial data. I watched through the hidden wide-angle camera as Wyatt aggressively patted down his expensive tailored suit jacket, searching for his mobile phone. He actually believed he had successfully outmaneuvered me. He thought the heavy steel lockbox was a genuine security measure rather than a deliberate psychological staging tool designed to convince him the contents were overwhelmingly valuable. He completely ignored the fundamental rule of espionage. If something incredibly valuable is remarkably easy to find, it is absolutely guaranteed to be a lethal trap. I calmly accepted a localized anesthetic injection from the surgeon, my eyes remaining completely locked onto the digital screen. Wyatt dialed my private number, pacing back and forth across my ruined bedroom, his chest puffed out with manufactured authority. He was about to demand a massive ransom, entirely unaware that he had just officially handed me the precise mechanism required to permanently seal his inevitable fate today. My secondary mobile device buzzed sharply on the sterile metal tray. I answered the call, immediately placing it on speakerphone so I could simultaneously watch his facial expressions on the video feed. Dominic. He barked, his voice thick with a forced manufactured confidence. I know you are alive. My father completely failed to finish the job last night, but I just succeeded where he screwed up. I have your little black book. I have the master client list containing every single one of your corrupt politicians, your offshore accounts, and your cartel connections. I let a long, dense silence stretch across the line, deliberately maximizing his mounting anxiety. I did not sound panicked or surprised. I let out a low, cold, calculated laugh that resonated deeply through the phone speaker, causing him to visibly flinch on the camera monitor. "You really think you have acquired leverage, Wyatt?" I asked, my tone dropping into a highly lethal and unwavering register, completely destroying his arrogant illusion. "You think a man who has successfully dismantled global criminal syndicates for 30 years leaves his most sensitive intelligence sitting in a simple steel box inside a vulnerable downtown apartment? You are completely out of your depth and utterly unprepared for this reality." Wyatt gripped the leather-bound book tighter, pacing aggressively toward the bedroom window. "This is not a bluff, old man," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the intense psychological pressure. "I will hand this entire ledger directly over to the federal authorities and the national press. I will expose every single one of your dirty clients unless you wire exactly $5 million into a secure, untraceable account by midnight tonight. You are going to buy my absolute silence right now, and you are going to immediately fund my permanent escape from this city." I watched him on the screen, his face sweating, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He was utterly convinced he had finally successfully checkmated me in this high-stakes psychological war. "Wyatt," I replied, my voice devoid of any human empathy, "I am not going to wire you a single dime. I want you to stop pacing. I want you to stand perfectly still, open that book again, and look much closer at the pages." Wyatt frowned, halting his frantic pacing. "Look closer at what exactly?" he demanded suspiciously, his arrogant facade finally cracking. "Look down at your fingertips, Wyatt," I instructed coldly. Wyatt looked slowly down at his shaking hands, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. A bright, unmistakable neon blue chemical residue completely coated his fingertips, glowing vividly even in the dim lighting of the bedroom. The ink on the pages of the ledger was not standard printer ink. Every single page of that dummy book had been heavily saturated with a highly specialized military-grade ultraviolet reactive dye that instantly bonds to human skin upon contact. "You are currently holding a physical GPS tracking beacon emitting a localized emergency distress signal," I informed him calmly. "I triggered the silent alarm the exact second you smashed the lockbox." The sudden deafening wail of multiple approaching police sirens pierced the air outside, rapidly converging on the apartment building from every direction. Wyatt dropped the book as if it were burning coal, stumbling backward in absolute terror. He frantically rushed to the window and looked out. 4 heavily armed local police cruisers had already completely surrounded the main lobby entrance, their flashing red and blue emergency lights illuminating his horrified face. He was now hopelessly trapped. Wyatt stared through the grimy window pane of my old apartment, watching the flashing red and blue emergency lights wash over the brick walls. He realized instantly that his grand extortion plan had just completely imploded. The heavy thud of police boots echoing up the primary stairwell snapped him out of his paralyzed terror. He dropped the glowing ledger onto the floor and sprinted toward the rear kitchen window. He kicked out the rusted screen and scrambled onto the rusted metal fire escape just as the front door was violently breached by the tactical unit. He descended the iron stairs with reckless desperation, tearing his expensive suit jacket on a protruding bolt and scraping his hands completely raw. He dropped into the dark, narrow alleyway, avoiding the sweeping beams of police flashlights slicing through the darkness. He sprinted blindly through the freezing rain, slipping on discarded garbage and splashing through stagnant puddles. He was completely out of options. His corporate allies had abandoned him. His political father had failed him. The federal government was actively hunting him. He dialed the only number left in his contacts. It was Mickey, a brutal local loan shark who controlled the underground gambling syndicate Wyatt owed a massive fortune to. Wyatt promised Mickey double the principal loan amount, plus a staggering extraction fee for immediate extraction. 5 minutes later, a battered cargo van skidded into the alleyway. 2 heavily armed enforcers grabbed Wyatt by the collar of his ruined bespoke suit and dragged him violently into the back of the vehicle. The van sped off into the night, slipping seamlessly through the outer police perimeter. Wyatt had successfully evaded immediate federal incarceration, but he had officially crossed the absolute point of no return. He was no longer a disgraced corporate executive. He was a desperate federal fugitive entirely at the mercy of violent street-level criminals. The cargo van dumped Wyatt at a decaying roach-infested motel located on the absolute outer fringes of the city limits. The enforcers stripped him of his remaining cash and threw a prepaid burner phone onto the stained mattress before locking the hollow wooden door from the outside. Wyatt was left completely alone in a freezing room that smelled of damp mildew and cheap chemicals. He sat on the edge of the sagging bed, shivering violently in his torn, expensive garments. He stared at a single dented can of dollar store beans resting on the peeling laminate nightstand. He had no can opener, no running hot water, and absolutely no remaining dignity. I watched his complete psychological deterioration live from the secure monitors in my command center. I had effortlessly hacked the camera of the cheap burner phone the syndicate provided him. I sat back in my leather chair, sipping black coffee and watching the arrogant white-collar predator completely unravel. I knew exactly what that specific poverty felt like. During my early 20s, before I secured my federal clearance and climbed the ranks of the Treasury Department, I lived in a freezing slum exactly like that one. I survived on stale bread and rationed electricity while studying forensic accounting under a single flickering light bulb. I learned how to endure extreme deprivation and turn that intense suffering into unbreakable mental armor. Men like Wyatt Kensington do not possess that kind of armor. They are constructed entirely of unearned privilege and fragile entitlement. They believe their worth is inherently tied to their bank accounts and their societal status. When you strip a man like Wyatt of his silk ties, his luxury vehicles, and his sycophantic subordinates, his entire psychological foundation shatters into dust. I watched him throw the heavy can of beans violently against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably as the cold reality of his new existence crushed him. The deprivation of status was infinitely more lethal to his mind than any physical torture could ever be. He was breaking down exactly according to my precise calculations. He assumed the local crime syndicate was actively protecting him, shielding him from my reach while he figured out a way to strike back. He fundamentally misunderstood the basic mechanics of organized crime. Criminal syndicates do not operate on loyalty or mutual respect. They operate strictly on capital. And nobody in this city possessed more fluid, untraceable capital than the man currently hunting him. I monitored his frantic pacing and his pathetic attempts to formulate a survival strategy. He was a weak parasite, completely separated from his wealthy host body. He was rapidly spiraling into total madness, preparing himself for his final, ultimate destruction. Wyatt believed the armed enforcers standing outside his door were hired bodyguards, ensuring the police could not reach him. He was completely unaware that the established hierarchy of violence had fundamentally shifted overnight. I did not waste my time contacting the local authorities to report his exact location. Informing the police would only initiate a prolonged bureaucratic standoff and grant Wyatt access to a public defender. I bypassed the legal system entirely using the absolute superiority of overwhelming financial dominance. I routed a fraction of my offshore operational funds and directly contacted the senior boss of Mickey Underground Syndicate. I did not negotiate or make requests. I executed a hostile corporate buyout of Wyatt's entire illicit street debt, paying a substantial premium well above the original principal. I essentially purchased the exclusive rights to his life. The local mob no longer answered to Mickey regarding this specific asset. They answered directly to me through the untraceable corporate entity of Apex Holdings. The heavy footsteps outside Wyatt's room suddenly stopped. He heard the distinct metallic click of the deadbolt being locked from the outside. Wyatt rushed to the door, turning the brass handle frantically, but it refused to yield. He pressed his face against the grimy peephole. The two armed enforcers were standing perfectly still, facing the door like rigid sentinels, explicitly blocking his only avenue of escape. The burner phone resting on the stained mattress suddenly rang, vibrating aggressively against the cheap exposed springs. Wyatt lunged for it, pressing the plastic receiver to his ear. "Hello," he gasped, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "Your debt has been entirely liquidated, Wyatt," I stated, my voice resonating with cold, lethal authority. "The men standing outside your door do not work for your loan shark anymore. They are my direct employees. You are not hiding in a safe house. You are sitting inside a cage that I personally purchased for you. There is absolutely nowhere left to run. You belong entirely to me now." Wyatt dropped the phone as if it had physically burned his skin. He backed away from the door, his eyes darting frantically around the decaying walls of his squalid prison. He realized with absolute horrifying certainty that his wealth, his family name, and his criminal connections had all completely failed him. Trapped inside the freezing room and completely driven out of his mind by sheer terror, Wyatt made a final catastrophic decision. His polished corporate intellect was completely gone, replaced by the highly venomous spite of a cornered, dying rat. He knew he was never going to walk out of that decaying room as a free man. If he was going down, he resolved to inflict the ultimate irreversible suffering upon the man who systematically destroyed his entire life. He reached into the inner lining of his ruined suit jacket and retrieved a hidden encrypted flash drive containing his last secret reserve of untraceable cryptocurrency. He plugged the drive directly into the burner phone and accessed a heavily encrypted dark web portal. He navigated past the illegal marketplaces and entered a verified, highly exclusive assassin network. His hands shook violently as he bypassed the standard extortion protocols and initiated a direct lethal contract. He transferred his entire remaining digital fortune to a syndicate of professional killers. He did not target me. He typed in the exact home address and daily schedule of Camille. The contract was officially confirmed and marked for immediate execution. The digital confirmation of the hit contract triggering on the dark web routed an alert to my secondary encrypted server. Wyatt thought he was engaging an anonymous ghost network, but my algorithms had been mirroring his internet traffic since the moment he plugged the flash drive into the compromised burner phone. The target was my daughter. The location was her veterinary clinic. The scheduled execution time was exactly 11 o'clock at night after the remaining administrative staff locked the doors and went home. The hitman arrived with the silent, terrifying precision of a seasoned professional. He parked his vehicle far from the main illuminated lot. He left a stolen sedan idling in the shadows of the adjacent industrial alleyway. I watched him emerge from the darkness wearing a matte black tactical jacket and a fitted face covering. He moved fluidly across the wet asphalt, keeping his body positioned perfectly in the blind spots of the standard security cameras. He carried a suppressed semi-automatic pistol equipped with a thermal optic sight, clearly intending to execute a swift, localized breach through the rear staff entrance of the clinic. Camille was currently inside, working late to finish surgical reports, entirely unaware that a contracted killer was standing less than 50 feet away from her office window. The hitman paused at the heavy steel security door, extracting a specialized lock-picking device from his tactical vest. He operated with the absolute confidence of a predator who believed he controlled the entire environment. He was completely wrong. He was not the apex predator in this parking lot. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the industrial dumpster directly behind him, deliberately allowing the heel of my heavy orthopedic shoe to scrape loudly against the concrete pavement. The metallic sound sliced through the quiet night, instantly freezing his movements. The hitman spun around with terrifying speed, leveling the suppressed muzzle of his weapon squarely at the center of my chest. His thermal optics glowed a faint, menacing red in the darkness. I did not raise my hands, flinch, or break eye contact. I simply stood there under the flickering amber glow of a distant street lamp, holding a thick manila folder in my left hand. I did not draw a weapon because I do not carry one. During my 30 years hunting the most ruthless cartel bosses and corporate criminals on the planet, I learned a fundamental truth about human violence. A bullet can only end a single life, but leverage can completely control generations. Guns are the crude, clumsy tools of desperate men who lack the intellectual capacity to manipulate an adversary core vulnerabilities. I utilize forensic leverage. I dismantle the psychological foundation of my enemies until their weapons become entirely useless. I looked at the masked killer and spoke with absolute chilling authority. "Lower the firearm. Marcus," I commanded, using his real birth name. The hitman visibly stiffened, his finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "You do not exist on the federal grid," I continued, my voice echoing off the brick walls. "You operate exclusively through proxy servers and encrypted cryptocurrency wallets. You think your identity is entirely insulated from the physical world, but your ex-wife Elena and your 2 daughters currently reside in a gated community in Scottsdale, Arizona. Your youngest daughter plays competitive soccer on Tuesday afternoons. Your oldest is applying to state colleges. I know exactly where they sleep, Marcus." The muzzle of the gun wavered slightly as the psychological shockwave hit him. "You are bluffing," he hissed, his voice muffled through the dark fabric of his mask. I slowly extended my arm, holding the manila folder out toward him. "I am the man who intercepted the exact encrypted payment Wyatt Kensington just sent you," I stated coldly. "I am also the man who just deposited exactly $1 million untraceable dollars into a secure offshore account held in your youngest daughter's name. Open the folder, Marcus." The hitman hesitated, his professional training battling the sudden overwhelming threat to his family. He cautiously reached out with his free hand, snatching the folder from my grip while keeping the weapon trained on my heart. He flipped it open, using the ambient streetlight to scan the documents. The pages contained high-resolution photographs of his ex-wife and daughters taken just hours ago, alongside the irrefutable banking confirmation of the massive offshore wire transfer. I had completely bypassed his tactical defenses and struck directly at his biological imperative to protect his bloodline. He was no longer a contracted killer executing a target. He was a compromised father staring down the barrel of absolute financial and familial ruin. The hitman stared at the banking confirmation codes and the photographs of his children, his breathing turning ragged and uneven behind his tactical mask. The flawless execution plan he had mapped out for Camille was entirely shattered. He looked up from the documents and locked eyes with me, finally realizing the terrifying magnitude of the adversary standing in front of him. I was not a security guard or a local police officer. I was a man who possessed the exact capability to eradicate his entire family tree with a single keystroke. "You have a very simple binary decision to make right now, Marcus," I said, stepping slowly toward him, closing the physical distance until the suppressed barrel of his pistol was mere inches from my chest. "You can pull that trigger and finish the contract Wyatt paid you for. If I die tonight, a dead man switch embedded in my servers will automatically forward your entire operational history, your real identity, and the exact location of your family to every single federal intelligence agency and rival syndicate in the country. Your daughters will spend the rest of their lives being hunted by men infinitely worse than me." I paused, letting the lethal reality of my words sink deep into his psychological armor. Or I offered, lowering my voice to a dangerous whisper. "You can take the $1 million I just gifted your family, drop the weapon on the concrete and vanish permanently into the night. Take the money and vanish, or pull the trigger and destroy your own bloodline. Your choice." The heavy, oppressive silence of the industrial alleyway stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. The hitman looked at my face, searching for any sign of hesitation or bluff. He found absolutely nothing but cold, unyielding certainty. I had comprehensively outmaneuvered him. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the suppressed pistol, aiming the muzzle at the wet asphalt. He engaged the safety mechanism with a sharp metallic click. He dropped the weapon onto the ground, letting it clatter heavily against the concrete. He clutched the manila folder tightly to his chest, turned his back on me, and walked rapidly away into the shadows, completely abandoning the contract. The apex predator had been entirely domesticated by a superior force. I stood alone in the freezing parking lot, listening to the engine of his stolen sedan roar to life and speed away into the darkness. Camille remained perfectly safe inside her clinic, completely unaware of the lethal violence that had just been averted feet from her door. I reached down and picked up the discarded suppressed pistol, feeling the heavy cold steel in my hand. It was the ultimate physical proof of Wyatt Kensington's desperate failure. He had utilized his final remaining resource to strike at my daughter, and he had missed completely. I returned to my vehicle and drove directly to a 24-hour courier service operating on the outskirts of the city. I placed the loaded firearm into a secure, reinforced shipping box. I wrote down the exact address of the squalid, roach-infested motel where my mob enforcers were currently holding Wyatt hostage. I slid a single sheet of plain white paper into the box, resting it directly on top of the lethal weapon. Written in bold black ink was a single word: checkmate. I sealed the package and shipped it out, guaranteeing standard overnight delivery. The overnight courier package arrived at the decaying motel exactly at noon the following day. Wyatt had been pacing the cramped, mildew-stained room for hours, jumping at every passing shadow and the heavy footsteps of the syndicate enforcers stationed right outside his solid wood door. He tore open the reinforced cardboard box with shaking, desperate fingers, expecting a ransom demand or a final set of impossible instructions from his corporate enemies. Instead, he pulled back the thick bubble wrap packing material and found the cold, heavy steel of the suppressed semi-automatic pistol resting at the bottom of the box. It was the exact weapon he had purchased on the dark web to assassinate my daughter. Resting directly on top of the black metal was a crisp, white sheet of paper bearing a single handwritten word: checkmate. Wyatt collapsed backward onto the stained mattress, letting out a guttural, hollow sound of pure, absolute terror. He realized instantly that his hired hitman had been compromised, intercepted, and completely neutralized by my hand. He was utterly defenseless. He scrambled backward, pressing his spine against the peeling wallpaper, pulling his knees to his chest like a frightened child. A heavy metallic click echoed through the silent room as the deadbolt unlocked from the outside. The hollow wooden door slowly creaked open. The two armed enforcers standing guard in the hallway immediately stepped aside, lowering their heads in silent, absolute deference. I stepped over the threshold into the squalid room, the heavy door clicking shut, sealing us inside together. I did not knock, and I did not announce my arrival. Wyatt stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, the suppressed pistol resting uselessly on the floor between us. He was a completely broken man, entirely consumed by the paralyzing realization that his absolute destruction had finally arrived in person. I stepped further into the freezing, dimly lit motel room and immediately dropped the physical masquerade I had maintained for 4 long years. The pronounced limp vanished entirely. The hunched shoulders rolled back, locking into a rigid, imposing posture. I stood at my full height, expanding my chest and radiating the terrifying, suffocating aura of an elite federal operative. Wyatt watched this physical transformation in horrified silence. The harmless old black postal worker he had relentlessly mocked at Thanksgiving dinners evaporated into thin air, replaced by a highly lethal apex predator who commanded the very syndicate thugs holding him captive. I stepped over the discarded firearm and slowly removed my heavy winter coat, draping it meticulously over the back of a broken plastic chair. During my 30 years as a senior forensic auditor for the Treasury Department, I never once utilized physical torture to extract a confession from a target. I broke the most hardened cartel bosses and the most arrogant corporate billionaires using a completely different methodology. I utilized absolute psychological dismantling. When you trap an apex narcissistic predator in a confined physical space and systematically strip away their hoarded wealth, their corrupt political connections, and their fabricated illusion of superiority, their mind turns completely to fragile glass. They shatter violently under the crushing weight of their own manufactured vulnerability, exposing the weak coward hiding inside. Wyatt was currently experiencing that exact psychological implosion happening in real time. He scrambled frantically into the far corner of the cramped room, knocking over a cheap ceramic lamp in his blind, terrified panic. "You are not a simple postal worker," he choked out, his voice cracking with dry, heaving sobs that shook his entire frame. "Who exactly are you? What kind of monster are you?" I did not answer his desperate, frantic questions. I simply walked forward with measured steps, cornering him entirely against the cracked plaster wall. My absolute silence was a calculated weapon, pressing down heavily on his chest and restricting his oxygen intake. He looked up at my cold, unyielding expression, frantically searching for any trace of the compassionate, forgiving father-in-law. He thought he could effortlessly manipulate for his own financial gain. He found absolutely nothing but a dark, empty void. He realized instantly that I possessed the capacity to order the violent men standing outside to enter the room and end his miserable life without leaving a single trace of forensic evidence behind in the slums. I pulled a thick legal binder from my leather briefcase and dropped it onto the cheap laminate table separating us, letting the loud thud echo through the room. The heavy binder slammed against the cheap laminate surface with a sharp crack that made Wyatt violently flinch. I unclipped the binding and spread the documents out in a perfectly neat row. They were not financial ledgers or criminal indictments designed to send him to prison. They were comprehensive, ironclad divorce papers drafted by elite lawyers. I pulled a silver fountain pen from my shirt pocket and placed it directly on top of the signature line. These documents outline the absolute and unconditional dissolution of your marriage to my daughter. I stated, my voice echoing off the grimy walls with lethal clarity. You are entirely surrendering all parental rights to your son immediately. You are waiving any and all claims to the veterinary clinic, the residential property, and any future financial support or alimony. You are walking away from Camille with absolutely nothing but the torn, expensive clothes currently on your back. Wyatt stared at the papers, his chest heaving with frantic, panicked breaths. I will not sign them, he stammered, a pathetic remnant of his corporate arrogance attempting to surface one last time. I have legal rights. You cannot legally force me to abandon my own child without a fight. I leaned across the table, placing both of my hands flat against the documents, entirely dominating his physical space. I am not negotiating a fair settlement with you, Wyatt, I whispered coldly, staring directly into his soul. I am offering you a singular biological choice. You can pick up that silver pen and sign away your fabricated rights to my family right now, or I will unlock that door and allow the heavily armed men standing in the hallway to step inside and collect the massive financial debt you owe their syndicate boss. They do not care about family law or custody battles. They only care about extracting their literal pound of flesh. Sign the documents right now. Surrender all rights or the men outside will come in. The brutal, inescapable reality of his situation finally crushed him entirely. Wyatt let out a loud, agonizing wail, covering his face with his trembling hands. He was sobbing violently, the sound echoing pathetically through the decaying room. He reached out with a shaking hand, grabbed the silver pen, and hastily scrawled his signature across every single page, effectively erasing his toxic existence from my daughter's life forever. I gathered the signed divorce documents, inspecting each signature with clinical precision before sliding them safely into my briefcase. The legal extraction of my daughter was officially complete. I turned my back on the sobbing, broken man huddled in the corner, prepared to walk out of the motel and leave him to his inevitable criminal prosecution. As my hand gripped the brass doorknob, the sound of crying abruptly stopped. A rapid series of loud, aggressive keystrokes echoed from the bed. I looked back over my shoulder. Wyatt was hunched over his laptop, his finger slamming down heavily on the enter key. A twisted, spiteful grin stretched across his tear-stained face. You think you won? He hissed, his voice dripping with pure, venomous malice. I just triggered a dead man switch. I routed a massive trove of falsified financial documents framing Camille for federal tax fraud and offshore embezzlement directly to the regional director of the FBI. If I am going to burn in federal prison, I am dragging your precious daughter straight down to hell with me. I watched the digital confirmation bar flash bright green across Wyatt's laptop screen, verifying the massive encrypted data transfer was successfully routed to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He slumped back against the peeling motel wall, panting heavily with a sickly, triumphant grin stretching across his tear-stained face. He genuinely believed he had just launched a lethal, irreversible strike against the most vulnerable target in my life. I did not waste a single second violently breaking his jaw or delivering a pointless physical retaliation. I simply turned my back on the pathetic broken man and walked rapidly out of the squalid room, leaving him to the absolute mercy of the syndicate enforcers waiting silently in the hallway. I climbed into my vehicle and aggressively pushed the engine to its absolute maximum limit, tearing through the suburban streets toward my daughter's residence. I knew precisely how the federal authorities operated when presented with high-priority financial terrorism targets. They do not send polite investigative inquiries. They execute immediate, overwhelming tactical raids. I arrived at Camille's house just as the black armored federal transport vans violently breached the quiet neighborhood perimeter. A dozen heavily armed tactical agents wearing dark tactical gear and carrying suppressed assault rifles poured out of the vehicles, instantly surrounding the entire property. The blinding glare of high-intensity searchlights washed over the immaculate front lawn. Camille was standing in the open doorway, clutching her son to her chest, trembling in absolute sheer terror as the aggressive tactical team stormed up her front walkway, shouting deafening commands. Wyatt thought he was brilliantly dragging his innocent ex-wife straight down into a federal prison cell to suffer alongside him, but he fundamentally misunderstood how deeply I controlled the board. He underestimated my total absolute power. I sprinted across the damp, manicured grass and placed myself firmly between the advancing federal agents and my terrified daughter. I raised my hands slowly, keeping my palms completely open and visible, ensuring the aggressive tactical operators did not perceive any sudden physical threat. "Drop your weapons and step back immediately," the lead tactical officer roared, leveling the blinding beam of his weapon-mounted flashlight directly into my eyes. I did not flinch or break my imposing posture. I stood like an unyielding concrete barrier, completely shielding Camille and my grandson from the intense, terrifying chaos unfolding on their front porch. I understood exactly why these agents were executing this raid with such extreme prejudice. Wyatt had maliciously utilized a highly sophisticated algorithmic spoofing technique to fabricate a massive digital paper trail directly linking Camille's veterinary practice to a notorious international tax fraud syndicate. The federal system flagged her clinic as a primary hub for offshore embezzlement. What the armed agents actively swarming the property did not know was that they were blindly following a financial tracking protocol that I personally designed and implemented 15 years ago. During my extensive tenure at the Treasury Department, I wrote the exact foundational code the FBI currently utilizes to detect and intercept rapid transnational wire fraud. I understood the precise structural limitations and the inherent blind spots of their automated analytical software. Wyatt thought he was a genius for weaponizing my own systemic creation against my family. He was hopelessly unaware that the architect of a digital security protocol always builds a hidden back door to instantly override the automated commands. I remained perfectly still as 4 heavily armed agents aggressively closed the distance, aiming their suppressed rifles directly at my chest. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. I looked directly at the senior agent coordinating the raid and spoke with the sharp, absolute authority of a commanding federal operative. "You are executing an invalid warrant based entirely on a fabricated algorithmic false positive," I stated coldly, my voice easily cutting through the loud, chaotic shouting of the tactical team. "The data packet your regional director received 45 minutes ago is a deliberately manufactured diversion designed to obscure the actual primary target." The tactical officers hesitated for a fraction of a second, completely caught off guard by my absolute clinical understanding of their operational timeline and internal communications. Camille sobbed heavily behind me, clutching my jacket desperately. I kept my back entirely straight, refusing to surrender a single inch of ground to the advancing federal agents. I knew exactly how to dismantle their entire operation from the inside out. But first, I needed to physically remove the target from my daughter's back and transfer the federal crosshairs completely onto myself immediately. The senior field agent stepped forward, gripping his radio tightly as he evaluated the highly unusual situation. He clearly expected a panicked, confused civilian, but he was facing a man who completely controlled the operational tempo. "Sir, you need to step away from the primary suspect right now, or you will be arrested for severe federal obstruction," he commanded, his voice loud but laced with a sudden trace of uncertainty. I did not move away from Camille. Instead, I slowly lowered my arms and extended both of my wrists directly toward him in a clear, unambiguous gesture of total surrender. "Camille is absolutely innocent of all fabricated charges," I declared, my voice booming across the illuminated front yard. "The offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the entire network of tax fraud documents sitting on your director's desk were exclusively orchestrated by me. I am the sole architect of the entire financial syndicate you are actively hunting tonight. I am the one you want. Arrest me." The admission hit this tactical team like a physical shockwave. The agents immediately shifted their suppressed weapons away from my daughter and locked their sights entirely onto me. 2 heavily armored officers rushed forward, forcefully grabbing my extended arms and wrenching them violently behind my back. The cold, heavy steel of the federal handcuffs clamped tightly around my wrists, biting sharply into my skin. I did not resist their aggressive handling. Camille screamed out my name, her voice cracking with pure agonizing terror as she watched the armed men violently manhandle her father. She attempted to rush forward, but I turned my head and locked eyes with her, delivering a powerful, piercing look of absolute unwavering reassurance. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod, silently communicating that every single piece of this terrifying ordeal was perfectly calculated and entirely under my strict control. "Do not say a single word to anyone, Camille," I instructed firmly as the agents roughly shoved me down the front walkway. "Keep the doors locked and protect my grandson. I will fix this immediately." I allowed the federal agents to aggressively throw me into the dark, cramped back seat of their heavily armored SUV. The heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing me inside the mobile prison. I sat perfectly still as the transport vehicle sped rapidly away from the suburban neighborhood, successfully neutralizing the immediate threat to my family and bringing me exactly where I needed to be. The federal transport vehicle arrived at the highly secured regional headquarters, delivering me directly into the subterranean holding facility. I was aggressively processed, stripped of my personal belongings, and marched into a sterile, windowless interrogation room. The heavy steel door locked behind me, leaving me entirely alone in the freezing, brightly lit concrete box. I sat perfectly upright at the cold metal table, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from my tightly cuffed wrists. I stared directly into the black lens of the surveillance camera, recording my every movement, completely unbothered by the severe federal charges hanging over my head. 10 agonizing minutes passed in absolute deafening silence before the heavy door finally unlocked with a loud electronic buzz. The lead agent in charge of the entire regional task force stepped into the room holding a thick manila folder. He was a seasoned veteran with a hardened expression who had built his career prosecuting untouchable billionaires. He looked up from the fabricated dossier and locked eyes with me. His stern expression instantly vanished. The lead agent abruptly stopped walking, snapped his heels together, and suddenly stood at strict absolute attention, saluting me. The heavily reinforced steel door locked behind the departing tactical officers, leaving me alone with the senior regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director Thomas Reynolds did not sit down at the cold metal interrogation table. He remained locked in a rigid posture of absolute military deference, his eyes fixed firmly on the man sitting across from him in a cheap, faded cardigan. The sterile, hostile environment of the federal holding facility instantly evaporated completely, transforming the windowless concrete box into a classified operational briefing room. The heavy steel handcuffs binding my wrists were immediately unlocked and discarded onto the table with a loud metallic clank. Reynolds understood exactly what my biometric scan had triggered in the federal database. The system did not flag me as a hostile criminal target or a suburban tax fraud suspect. It recognized a highly classified Tier 1 operational clearance that superseded his own regional authority. "You deliberately intercepted a federal raid on your own daughter property to force a direct, secure audience with me," Reynolds stated, his voice dropping into a hushed, reverent whisper. "The entire tactical deployment was completely manipulated by your hands." I slowly massaged my bruised wrists, maintaining absolute unyielding eye contact. I did not apologize for hijacking his tactical team or wasting federal resources. I needed your undivided attention. Director Reynolds and I required a completely secure off-the-grid location to hand over intelligence that is going to fundamentally destabilize the political and financial infrastructure of this entire state. I reached down to the floor and picked up the cheap, battered faux leather briefcase that the tactical agents had confiscated from my vehicle during my aggressive arrest. I placed it squarely in the center of the interrogation table. The time for playing defensive suburban games was officially over. I popped the dual brass latches on the battered briefcase. The metallic clicks echoed loudly. I reached inside and withdrew a massive 500-page bound dossier, placing it onto the cold metal table. The heavy document landed with a profound thud that commanded absolute silence. This is the complete, unredacted financial autopsy of the Kensington family empire. I stated, my voice resonating with lethal authority. It contains every single illegal wire transfer, every fabricated vendor invoice, and every corrupt offshore shell company managed by Richard Sterling and shielded by State Senator Harlan Kensington. Director Reynolds stared at the towering stack of paper, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the evidence resting inches from his hands. "You did not compile this level of deep forensic intelligence in a single afternoon," he murmured, his eyes scanning the dense columns of encrypted routing numbers and executive communication logs printed on the top page. "I have been meticulously tracking this specific money laundering syndicate for 3 consecutive years," I replied, leaning forward to assert total physical dominance over the briefing space. "The very first day my daughter introduced Wyatt Kensington to me, I recognized the distinct, arrogant profile of a white-collar predator. Wyatt wore tailored Italian suits and flashed an Ivy League pedigree, but his financial foundation smelled entirely of toxic debt and corporate fraud. I never trusted his polished facade. While Camille was busy planning their beautiful suburban wedding, I was actively building a digital backdoor directly into his personal wealth management portfolio. I quietly watched him siphon illegal capital from his billionaire boss to fund his lavish lifestyle, and I meticulously documented every single time Senator Harlan intervened to bury his son's catastrophic mistakes. I intentionally maintained the pathetic disguise of a weak, limping retired postal worker to ensure the Kensingtons never viewed me as a legitimate threat. They were completely blinded by their own deeply ingrained racial and class prejudices. They arrogantly believed I was fundamentally incapable of understanding their sophisticated financial crimes. That fatal underestimation allowed me to operate completely undetected within their inner circle, gathering irrefutable proof of their massive transnational criminal enterprise. Reynolds slowly turned the first page of the dossier, his seasoned eyes widening as he comprehended the devastating scale of the syndicate. The fabricated tax fraud charges Wyatt just filed against Camille to cover his escape are entirely dismantled by the comprehensive transactional logs contained in Section 4I, instructed pointing directly at the precise tab. "This dossier definitively proves Wyatt weaponized your automated tracking protocols to frame his innocent wife. The fraudulent algorithmic spoofing attack is completely exposed. Camille is exonerated, and the Kensington political dynasty is fully ripe for federal slaughter." Director Reynolds flipped to the final page of the comprehensive financial summary. His seasoned eyes locked onto the highly specialized encrypted signature cipher printed at the absolute bottom of the document. The color completely drained from his hardened face. The heavy, rhythmic breathing in the quiet interrogation room abruptly stopped as a profound realization fundamentally shattered his entire professional understanding of the situation. He looked up from the dossier, his gaze locking onto my calm, unyielding expression with pure, unfiltered awe. "You are indeed the ghost," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of professional reverence and absolute shock. "You are the legendary Treasury Department phantom auditor who single-handedly dismantled the Chicago cartels and rewrote the entire federal financial tracking architecture. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has spent the last 10 years desperately searching for you to consult on our most complex transnational money laundering investigations. We assumed you had permanently retired or vanished off the global grid entirely. I did not confirm or deny the legendary moniker. I simply maintained my icy, terrifying composure." "The ghost stories are entirely irrelevant right now, Director Reynolds," I stated coldly. "What is incredibly relevant is the fact that you currently have heavily armed tactical agents terrorizing my innocent daughter based on a deliberately fabricated data packet." Reynolds did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He immediately reached for the secure tactical radio clipped to his tactical belt. The legendary reputation of the man sitting across from him carried more absolute jurisdictional weight than any standard federal warrant. "Command, this is Director Reynolds," he barked into the radio, his voice echoing with urgent, commanding authority. "The federal tax fraud charges against Camille are completely fabricated. I repeat, the innocent suspect is entirely exonerated from all suspicion. Fall back and completely secure the entire suburban perimeter." The heavy static crackled over the secure, encrypted channel, confirming the immediate evaporation of the terrifying threat against my innocent family. My daughter Camille was officially completely and perfectly safe. Her entire life was instantly restored by the absolute, undisputed power of my hidden federal identity. Reynolds placed the radio down and looked at me with strict military obedience, awaiting his next direct command from the legendary architect of the federal tracking system. I tapped the thick dossier on the table, demanding immediate and total federal mobilization. "Execute sweeping emergency arrest warrants for Richard Sterling, State Senator Harlan Kensington, and every single complicit board member named in that file," I commanded. Do not allow a single one of those corrupt predators to escape justice tonight." Reynolds nodded sharply, instantly, dispatching specialized tactical extraction teams across the entire city to systematically dismantle the untouchable Kensington political dynasty. The massive multi-million-dollar corporate money laundering syndicate was finally collapsing under the absolute undeniable weight of my forensic evidence. However, my primary target was no longer within the immediate city limits. As the heavily armed federal agents aggressively breached Senator Harlan's sprawling luxury estate and slapped cold steel handcuffs onto his pristine wrists, Wyatt was actively executing his desperate contingency plan. Miles away on the dark, secluded tarmac of a private suburban airfield, Wyatt Kensington was anxiously gripping a highly illegal fabricated passport. He was rapidly climbing the steep metal stairs of a massive, luxurious private jet, fully preparing to permanently flee to Europe and escape absolute total destruction. The freezing midnight wind whipped violently across the secluded private tarmac of the suburban airfield. Wyatt Kensington pulled the collar of his ruined designer jacket tightly around his neck, shivering uncontrollably as he hurried across the dark, illuminated concrete. He clutched a sleek black leather travel bag to his chest like a physical lifeline. Inside that bag was a flawlessly forged international passport, $50,000 in untraceable bearer bonds, and the absolute promise of permanent European salvation. The massive, sleek body of the twin-engine private jet loomed ahead of him, its engines already whining with a high-pitched, deafening roar as they primed for immediate takeoff. Wyatt reached the bottom of the steep aluminum boarding stairs and began his rapid ascent. With every single step he took, the crushing, paralyzing terror that had completely suffocated him for the past 48 hours began to finally evaporate. He actually believed he had successfully outmaneuvered the inevitable federal storm. He imagined his father, Senator Harlan, deploying an army of high-priced lawyers to tie up the local police force while he vanished into the untouchable sanctuary of a non-extradition country. He thought he was brilliant for triggering the false federal flag against Camille, assuming the chaotic raid would keep the entire law enforcement apparatus completely distracted. He reached the top of the stairs and handed his counterfeit biometric passport to the private flight attendant, waiting in the warm, luxurious cabin doorway. A sickly, triumphant smirk slowly stretched across his bruised, tear-stained face. He genuinely believed he had successfully won the ultimate game of survival. He was hopelessly unaware that the digital tracking net I had cast over his life was completely inescapable, and his private sanctuary was actually a highly complex, meticulously coordinated federal trap designed for him. 3 heavily armored federal pursuit vehicles tore through the outer perimeter fencing of the private airfield, their tires screeching violently against the wet asphalt. I did not ride in the back of the transport unit like a detained suspect or a passive civilian observer. I sat directly in the front passenger seat of the lead massive vehicle, dictating the exact tactical approach coordinates to Director Reynolds. I had completely shed the faded cardigans, the oversized orthopedic shoes, and the carefully calculated, hunched posture of the harmless retired postal worker. I was wearing my only bespoke, perfectly tailored midnight blue suit. It was a garment I commissioned specifically in London 20 years ago, reserved exclusively for the moments when I officially concluded a massive transnational operation and stood face to face with the predators I had successfully hunted. Wearing this suit was a psychological declaration of absolute dominance. It stripped away any lingering illusions my targets held regarding my intellect, my resources, or my lethal capability. It was the physical manifestation of the ghost. The federal vehicles skidded to a chaotic, aggressive halt, forming a tight tactical semicircle directly around the base of the private jet. The blinding high-intensity halogen spotlights mounted on the roofs of the SUVs instantly flooded the boarding stairs, washing out the surrounding pitch-black darkness. I stepped out of the vehicle, my spine perfectly straight, my shoulders broad, projecting the terrifying, unyielding authority of a man who commanded the very federal agents swarming the tarmac. I walked slowly and deliberately across the illuminated concrete, the sharp, confident click of my leather dress shoes echoing clearly over the deafening roar of the idling jet engines. I remembered the very first time I wore this exact suit. I had just frozen the accounts of a corrupt European banking cartel, entirely dismantling a billion-dollar syndicate without ever raising my voice or drawing a weapon. That specific cartel boss had looked at me with the exact same pathetic, bewildered arrogance that Wyatt Kensington possessed. Men like them build their entire identities on the false premise that wealth equals invulnerability. They construct towering glass castles of privilege and corruption, entirely forgetting that it only takes a single perfectly placed sonic frequency to shatter the entire structure into a million jagged pieces. I approached the base of the boarding stairs, standing firmly behind the defensive line of tactical federal agents carrying suppressed assault rifles. I looked up at the luxurious cabin doorway, my face a mask of cold, unblinking certainty. The final, inevitable act of Wyatt's absolute and total destruction was officially commencing, and I was going to supervise every single agonizing second of his complete downfall personally, right now. The flight attendant at the top of the steep aluminum stairs swiped Wyatt's meticulously forged passport through the digital security scanner. Instead of the standard green approval light, the small terminal instantly flashed a brilliant, blinding, and extremely harsh crimson-red warning. A loud, aggressive klaxon blared through the cabin interface. Wyatt froze, his triumphant smirk instantly collapsing into an expression of sheer, unadulterated panic. Before he could snatch the passport back or attempt to push past the attendant into the cabin, a team of 6 heavily armed federal tactical agents surged violently up the aluminum stairs. "Move, move, move!" The lead agent roared, his voice cutting fiercely through the engine noise. The agents swarmed Wyatt with ruthless, calculated precision. They grabbed him by the collar of his ruined jacket and the belt of his trousers, violently wrenching him backward out of the doorway. Wyatt screamed a pathetic, high-pitched wail of pure, absolute terror as the agents dragged him forcefully down the steep metal stairs. His highly expensive black leather bag slipped from his grasp, spilling the counterfeit cash and bearer bonds uselessly across the wet tarmac. He thrashed and kicked wildly, frantically, begging for a lawyer, completely oblivious to the undeniable fact that his cowardly legal representation had already abandoned him hours ago. The agents slammed him face first onto the cold, hard concrete at the base of the stairs, forcefully burying their knees into his spine. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his bruised wrists with a sharp, undeniable click of absolute finality. Wyatt lay pinned against the freezing ground, gasping for air, tears of sheer panic streaming down his face. The tactical agents forcefully hauled him up to his knees, completely immobilizing his arms. The wall of federal operators slowly parted, creating a direct, unobstructed path. I walked smoothly and confidently through the gap, stopping exactly 2 feet in front of his kneeling, trembling form. I looked down at him, my expression radiating cold, lethal supremacy. Wyatt stared up at my bespoke, tailored suit, my flawless posture, and the absolute deference the heavily armed federal agents displayed toward me. The horrifying realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The harmless, crippled old black man he had relentlessly mocked and abused for years was the very apex predator commanding his total and complete annihilation right here on the freezing airport tarmac tonight. Wyatt stared up at me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot, his chest heaving with frantic, desperate breaths. His reality had violently fractured, leaving him entirely unmoored in a terrifying new universe where he possessed zero power. He strained against the iron grip of the federal agents holding him, his face contorted in a mask of sheer disbelieving agony. "Who the hell are you?" he screamed, his voice cracking and echoing across the brightly illuminated tarmac. "What kind of monster are you?" I did not raise my voice or react to his pathetic, broken hysteria. I stepped forward smoothly, bypassing the federal agents, and leaned down until my face was merely inches from his sweating ear. "I am the permanent consequence of your arrogance, Wyatt," I whispered, my voice a deadly, icy current slicing directly into his fractured psyche. "I am the ghost." I stood up perfectly straight, signaling to the tactical team with a slight nod. "Throw this parasite into the back of the transport." The armored doors slammed violently shut instantly, plunging his screaming, ruined life into absolute and totally inescapable darkness. The heavy armored transport doors slamming shut marked the absolute and final end of Wyatt Kensington and his manufactured era of corporate dominance. Over the next 48 hours, the federal hammer came down on the Kensington family with apocalyptic force. Senator Harlan Kensington woke up to heavily armed tactical agents aggressively kicking in the mahogany front doors of his sprawling country estate. The $2 million certified check he had desperately tried to slide across the country club table to me was immediately seized as criminal evidence, along with his entire offshore financial portfolio. The legacy media conglomerate that he once used to run his vicious smear campaigns was now forced to broadcast his humiliating public arrest live on national television. Harlan was officially stripped of his prestigious committee chairmanships, permanently expelled from the state senate, and federally indicted on 73 counts of wire fraud, public corruption, and illegal campaign finance violations. His remaining assets were completely liquidated by the Treasury Department to pay mandatory federal restitution. Richard Sterling, the billionaire hedge fund manager, frantically attempted to flee to a non-extradition country, but my digital tracking protocols successfully flagged his encrypted passport at a private terminal in Geneva. He was aggressively extradited back to the United States in a secure federal transport plane, wearing a bright orange prison uniform instead of his usual tailored cashmere suit. The massive corporate money laundering syndicate they had arrogantly built was entirely dismantled and completely erased from the global financial ecosystem piece by piece. The toxic roots of their white-collar empire were ripped violently out of the ground, ensuring they could never again leverage their immense privilege to destroy innocent lives. The city was finally permanently cleansed of its most arrogant predators. Wyatt Kensington did not secure a high-priced defense attorney or negotiate a favorable plea deal. Without his billionaire boss or his powerful political father to shield him, the federal prosecutors aggressively pursued the absolute maximum allowable sentence for his extensive corporate crimes and his egregious attempted kidnapping. The federal judge handed down a staggering sentence of 25 years in a maximum security penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. He was officially and permanently stripped of his hoarded wealth, his societal status, and his physical freedom. 6 months after the dramatic tarmac arrest, I decided to visit him one final time. I did not wear my bespoke midnight blue suit. I wore a simple gray sweater and standard orthopedic shoes, intentionally returning to the unassuming physical appearance that had effortlessly fooled him for 4 long years. The federal maximum security prison was a bleak, oppressive fortress of reinforced concrete and razor wire. I sat in the sterile visitation room waiting patiently as the heavy steel door buzzed open with a loud metallic clank. Wyatt was escorted into the small room wearing a faded orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles secured by heavy iron chains. He had lost significant weight. The arrogant country club glow had completely vanished from his pale, sunken face, replaced entirely by the permanent hunted stare of a man who had hit absolute rock bottom. He sat heavily across the thick plexiglass partition, staring at me with a mixture of profound terror and lingering disbelief. He picked up the heavy black telephone receiver with shaking hands. I picked up my receiver and maintained steady, unyielding eye contact. "I did not come here to gloat, Wyatt," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any malice or triumph. "I came here to ensure you understand exactly why you are spending the rest of your natural life inside this cold concrete box." During my 3 decades hunting international syndicates, I learned that the most dangerous men are not the ones carrying heavy weapons. The most dangerous men are the ones who can completely erase their own ego and operate invisibly within the shadows. You built your entire pathetic existence on the superficial illusion of inherent superiority. You looked at my skin color, my modest house, and my manufactured limp, and you instantly categorized me as a weak, inferior target. You were so completely blinded by your unearned generational privilege that you never bothered to actually investigate the man sitting directly across from you at the dinner table. Your fatal error was not embezzling money or committing corporate tax fraud. Your ultimate fatal error was judging a book exclusively by its cover. Wyatt slowly lowered his head, unable to maintain eye contact as the crushing reality of his monumental failure washed over him one final time. He understood completely that his own blinding arrogance had orchestrated his total destruction. I placed the black plastic receiver back onto the cradle, stood up from the cold metal chair, and walked out of the federal penitentiary without looking back. The heavy steel doors locked firmly behind me, sealing him permanently into the dark, agonizing consequences of his own toxic actions. I drove back to the quiet suburban neighborhood where the air felt noticeably lighter and fundamentally pure. The suffocating, hostile presence of the Kensington family had been completely and entirely eradicated from our lives. I pulled my old vehicle into the busy parking lot of Camille Veterinary Clinic. The facility was absolutely thriving. The bright reception area was bustling with grateful clients and healthy animals. The fraudulent financial algorithms Wyatt had maliciously deployed against her business were entirely scrubbed from the federal database, ensuring her professional reputation remained utterly spotless. Camille stood behind the front reception desk reviewing medical charts with a bright, genuine smile, radiating a profound sense of newfound peace and absolute independence. The dark, heavy shadows of stress and fear that had haunted her eyes for 4 agonizing years were completely gone. She was no longer a terrified hostage trapped in a psychologically abusive marriage. She was a strong, resilient woman running a successful medical practice entirely on her own terms. I walked through the glass doors, and her face instantly lit up with pure, unfiltered joy. She walked rapidly around the desk and wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into a fierce, loving embrace. We did not need to discuss the federal indictments, the frozen offshore accounts, or the shattered political dynasty. The silent, unbreakable understanding between us was absolute. We had successfully weathered the ultimate violent storm and emerged entirely victorious. The massive psychological burden of constantly monitoring hostile financial networks and anticipating violent retaliations had officially lifted from my shoulders. The meticulous forensic traps I had set were permanently dismantled, and my encrypted laptop was safely powered down and secured back in its hidden floorboard compartment. I helped her close the clinic for the evening, locking the front doors and securing the building with a deep, profound sense of permanent security. The apex predators were locked in cages, and my family was finally safe. The following Sunday morning, the warm golden sunlight filtered peacefully through the kitchen windows of our quiet suburban home. I put my old, worn-out clothes back on, slipping comfortably into a faded gray cardigan and my standard orthopedic shoes. I stood at the hot stove, carefully flipping sweet golden pancakes on the iron griddle while my 4-year-old grandson played happily on the soft living room rug. The chaotic, violent world of dark web assassins, high-stakes political blackmail, and aggressive federal tactical raids felt like a distant, fading memory. Absolute order had been successfully and permanently restored to our daily lives. I placed a tall stack of warm pancakes onto the center of the kitchen table, just as Camille walked into the bright room, smiling warmly as she poured us both a large cup of fresh black coffee. I calmly resumed my chosen role as the gentle, protective grandfather, completely content in my quiet, peaceful anonymity. I had successfully proven that true absolute power does not require an expensive tailored suit or an arrogant shouting voice. The ultimate undeniable lesson of this entire terrifying ordeal was brutally simple. Never mistake humility for weakness. Furthermore, this ordeal solidified a secondary, equally vital truth: patience and silence are the most devastating weapons against arrogance. Predators like Wyatt and Harlan operate on loud intimidation and impulsive greed, believing that volume equates to absolute control. By remaining silent, by observing their patterns without emotional reaction, you allow them to completely dig their own graves. They will inevitably expose their deepest vulnerabilities because their massive egos simply cannot tolerate the quiet. True protection of your bloodline does not come from screaming back at the monsters. It comes from quietly building the exact steel cage that will eventually hold them. If you have ever had to outsmart a toxic person who completely underestimated your quiet strength, share your survival story in the comments below and subscribe for more tales of absolute justice.